Something watched me from the edge of the firelight. By Anonymous. I was sitting by my campfire late at night, just kind of staring into it and zoning out. I was out on a camping trip, and it was day 2 if I remember right. At some point, I realized that I was seeing a darker shape just beyond the edge of the firelight. If you know anything about being out at night in the woods with a fire, then you know that you can see whatever the fire illuminates, and everything beyond that is pretty much dead black. And that was how this looked. Except there was a figure there that was darker than the darkness, if that makes sense. It wasn't moving, it didn't even shift like the way people shift between their feet. It was just standing there. I told myself it was probably just a tree trunk that I hadn't noticed before. When I leaned to the side, the shape did not change, but the shadows around it did. I couldn't see any details, really. It was just a solid outline where there shouldn't have been one. I poked the fire to make it flare up and kind of hoped that the light would reach it. The flames rose, and the shape stayed exactly where it was. Then the fire suddenly dropped, like it literally was like somebody had dumped water on it. I did not relight it, and I went straight to my tent, where I basically huddled until the light came up. I don't think I slept all night, but when I came out, there was no tree, and nothing really there that should have made that kind of a figure, so I still have no idea what was out there with me. The Wrong Side of the Trace by Caleb R. I stopped going to the land between the lakes about 6 years ago. Most people around here just call it LBL. If you aren't local, you might know it from the ghost hunting shows talking about the beast of LBL, which is supposed to be some kind of werewolf. I don't buy into the wolf stuff. What I ran into wasn't a dog. It was something boring that turned terrifying. I grew up in Cadiz, so the recreation area was basically my backyard. It's a massive peninsula between Kentucky Lake and Lake Barkley. The vibe there is weird, because the government forced everyone out in the 60s to build it. They flooded towns, they moved bodies. They left the foundations of the houses and the old roadbeds deep in the woods. You can be walking through thick brush and suddenly step onto a paved driveway that leads to nowhere. It was late November. The leaves were mostly down, which means visibility should have been good. I wasn't hunting. I was just looking to clear my head. I took my truck down the trace, which is the main road running north to south through the park. I pulled off onto one of the gravel forestry roads near the Tennessee border side. I wanted to check out a spot on the map where an old cemetery was supposed to be. Not one of the maintained ones, one of the forgotten ones. I parked the truck at a trailhead that didn't look like it'd seen tires in months. I grabbed my day pack and a walking stick. The air was cold. I hiked in about 2 miles. The topography in LBL is deceptive. It looks flat from the road, but it's full of ravines and limestone ridges. I found the area where the cemetery was supposed to be. There were no headstones, just sunken depressions in the earth arranged in rows. It's a grim sight. It reminds you that people lived here and died here before the government turned it into a campground. I sat on a downed log to drink some water, and that's when the silence hit. Usually, the woods are noisy. There's squirrels rustling and birds and the wind and the few remaining leaves. But this was dead air. I think people call it the Oz effect. It felt like walking into a room where two people had just stopped fighting. I checked my watch. It was only 2:30 p.m., so plenty of light. I started walking back toward the truck, but I decided to cut across a ridge to save time. This was a mistake. I stepped over a rotting log and I heard a snap behind me. I stopped. The snap echoed. I waited for a little bit, but nothing else happened. I took another step. The sound came from behind me again. This was not an echo. An echo is instantaneous. This was delayed by maybe half a second. It sounded exactly like my boot hitting the dry leaves. The weight was the same and the cadence was too. I stood still for a solid minute. My heart started doing that heavy thumping thing in my throat. I told myself it was just a deer stalking me. Deer are curious. They'll follow you sometimes. I took 3 quick steps. The sound behind me matched it perfectly, but the delay was gone. It was synchronized now. I spun around. The woods were gray and brown, vertical lines of tree trunks. Nothing moved. I scanned the gaps between the oaks. I looked for the horizontal shape of an animal, but I didn't see anything. "Hello?" I called out. "Hello?" a voice said back. It wasn't an echo. It was my voice, like a recording. It had the same exact pitch and hesitation and upward inflection at the end. But it didn't come from the woods behind me. This time it came from directly above me. I looked up. There was nothing in the canopy. My stomach dropped, and I got that prickly feeling on the back of my neck. The kind that signals immediate danger. I started walking fast. I knew that if I ran, whatever this was would chase me. I kept my eyes forward, navigating the uneven ground. The footsteps were right on my heels now. They sounded heavier than me, and it didn't sound like boots anymore. It sounded like bare feet slapping against hard dirt. I reached a small creek bed. I had to slide down the embankment. My boots skidded on the mud. Behind me, I heard another skid, but it sounded wet and sloppy, like something large dragging itself through the slush. I scrambled up the other side of the ravine. I was breathing hard. I risked a glance over my shoulder. At the top of the ridge I had just ascended, there was a tree. A white oak. It looked normal for a second, but then I realized the proportions were wrong. The trunk split about 7 feet up, but the split wasn't wood. It was legs. It was standing perfectly still, blending in with the bark. It was way taller than I thought, maybe 8 or 9 feet. The legs were gray and thin, and they looked just like the surrounding timber. The upper body was indistinct, just a mass of gray that looked like a burl on the wood, but it had a face. It was just a flat, pale surface. There wasn't a nose or a mouth, but there were 2 dark spots where eyes should be. It was looking at the sky. And then it opened its mouth. "Hello?" it said. It was my voice again, but this time it was distorted, like somebody was playing it through a blown-out speaker. I didn't care about anything anymore. I ran. I tore through the briars. The thorns ripped my jeans and cut my hands, but I couldn't even feel it at the time. I just pumped my arms and legs, focusing on the flash of white gravel that would signal the road. I could hear it crashing through the woods behind me. It wasn't mimicking me anymore. It was moving with a terrifying, chaotic rhythm. It sounded like branches breaking and heavy thuds. This thing was fast. I saw the gravel road. I I burst out of the tree line and sprinted toward my truck. I fumbled for my keys and dropped them. And then I screamed. I actually screamed. I scrambled for the keys and snatched them up and jammed the fob into the door lock. I threw myself into the cab and locked the doors. I looked out the driver's side window. The tree line was empty. The crashing had stopped, and the silence was back. I started the engine and threw it into reverse. I backed out of that spot so fast, I almost put the truck in a ditch. I hammered the gas and didn't let up until I hit the paved surface of the trace. I drove all the way to Golden Pond, the visitor center, before I slowed down. I sat in the parking lot for an hour, just watching the other cars. Normal people, families on vacation. I watched a guy checking the air pressure on his camper tires. It felt weird to see normal life happening when I had just been hunted by a tree that spoke with my voice. I drove home. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't tell my buddies. I thought that was the end of it. But 2 days later, I was in my garage. I was organizing my tool bench. I had the garage door open, and it was maybe 9 p.m. at night. I live in a subdivision, so we have neighbors and streetlights. It's not the middle of the woods or anything. I dropped a wrench. It hit the concrete with a loud clang. From the backyard, from the darkness beyond the fence, I heard the exact same sound, with the same resonance, but delayed. I hit the button to close the garage door and stood there watching the gap at the bottom close. Just before the seal hit the concrete, I heard one more thing. Hello? It wasn't my voice this time. It sounded like a child, a little girl, and then it giggled. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't even go into my own backyard after dark. I put floodlights on every corner of my house and told my wife it was just for security, and she seemed to accept that. My electric bill is through the roof, but ask me if I care. I think it followed me home. Or maybe it was already here, who knows. I tried to convince myself that last one was just a neighbor kid messing around. But the sound came from the drainage ditch behind my lock. There are no kids that play back there. It's full of kudzu and snakes. Sometimes when I'm in the shower, I hear the water turn off before I actually turn the handle. Just for a split second. The sound cuts out, and then the water stops, like it's anticipating me. I checked the maps again yesterday. The place where I parked in LBL, that old road bed, well, I looked up the history. There was a homestead there back in the 1920s. It burned down. The records say that the family was never found. I don't know what that thing is. I don't think it's a ghost. Ghosts are dead people, right? But this thing felt like it was a part of the biology of the woods. Like a species we just haven't classified yet, because it knows how to hide too well. I'm moving next month. We're moving out to Arizona, somewhere with no trees, somewhere flat. If I hear an echo in the desert, well, at least I'll be able to see what's making it. If you do go to LBL, stay on the pavement. If you hear your own footsteps when you stop walking, don't look back. Just leave. My GPS kept sending me back to the same clearing. By Lucas. I was doing this long solo hike and relying on my phone's GPS to track my route. After a while, I realized I had passed the same open clearing like 3 different times. Every single time I checked the map, it would show me heading in a different direction. The clearing itself just felt really, kind of icky. Like it was too quiet, It had a hollow kind of feeling. I tried to ignore the GPS and I started using landmarks instead, but I still ended up back there. On the third pass, I noticed that the grass was flattened where I had already stood for a while looking at the map or the GPS. My phone buzzed with a reroute notification, even though I hadn't changed paths. That's when I shut it off completely. I picked a direction and walked without stopping. Fortunately, it worked. I didn't look at my GPS again until I was back at my car. Still can't tell you what that was all about, but I'm really glad that I got out of there. There Was Someone in the Background of My Photos by Marcus L. I did a short solo backpacking trip and took photos along the trail just to pass the time. Nothing felt off while I was out there. It was just quiet and kind of boring, but in a good way. When I got home and dumped the photos onto my computer, I noticed a shape behind me in one of them. It looked like a person standing between two trees, way farther back than anyone should have been. I checked the next photo, maybe 30 seconds later, at least that's when I took it, and the shape was closer. I don't remember hearing anybody walking. I didn't hear any branches breaking. In the last photo before I packed up, it was gone. I zoomed in until the image got grainy, and I just felt sick to my stomach. I deleted the whole folder, and ever since then, I really hate being photographed from behind. The Forest Went Completely Silent by Anonymous. I took a shortcut off the main trail because it looked pretty harmless on the map. The second I stepped off the path, every sound just dropped out. I couldn't hear a single bird, even the wind. It was like somebody had pressed a mute button. I could hear my own breathing, and it was way too clear in all the silence, which gave me a bit of a panic attack. I tried to calm down and I took a few more steps, and I felt this pressure in my ears, like altitude. When I stepped back onto the trail, all the sounds came back at once. I tested it again, stepping off and then back on, and it kept happening. I didn't go more than a foot into the trees after that. I finished up the hike fast, and I didn't explore anything else that day. Even now, I stick to the marked trails without exception. Something Whispered My Name on the Trail by Anonymous. I was hiking on an old logging trail in the afternoon, just killing some time before sunset. About a mile in, I heard somebody quietly say my name from off to the left. I figured it was just another hiker messing with me, and I answered back, which was a mistake. The voice said my name again, in the exact same tone, from the same distance away, like it hadn't moved at all. I started walking faster, and it kept happening every few minutes. It was never any closer or farther away from me. I couldn't hear footsteps or see anybody through the trees. At one point, I stopped completely. And after a few seconds, it whispered my name again, but softer than before. I didn't respond anymore. I turned around and walked back out to the trailhead without looking into the woods once. Thankfully, the voice did not follow me out. I followed a trail marker that wasn't on any map. By Jessica. I was hiking with a printed map and GPS, so I wasn't too worried about getting lost. At a fork that I didn't recognize, I saw this wooden trail marker nailed to a tree, which was pointing to my left. The trail that it pointed to looked pretty well maintained, so I figured I would follow it. After about 10 minutes, my GPS said that I was not on any marked trail. I turned around to go back, but that's when I realized that the trail behind me looked narrower and a lot different than it had before. And when I reached the fork again, the marker that had been pointing left was gone. I stood there much longer than I should have, but I was just trying to line everything up with the map. Eventually, I found the main trail by backtracking, but it took a really long time. Later that day, I checked, and there's no record of that fork anywhere. I still think about how confident I felt following that sign, and I'm just really glad I made it out. The Deep Fork River Witch by Travis B. I've lived in eastern Oklahoma my whole life. I grew up hearing stories from my Creek and Seminole buddies about things you aren't supposed to mess with in the woods. I always respected the culture, but I never really believed that a bird could steal your heart or that a dog could walk on two legs. I treated the woods with respect because of snakes and meth cooks, not magic. That changed 2 years ago. I was bank fishing on the Deep Fork River, a few miles west of Okmulgee. It's thick country out there. The river bottoms are full of hardwoods, tangled vines, and mud that will suck the boot right off your foot. It was late July. The air was heavy enough to wear, saturated with humidity and the sound of cicadas. I had hiked in about a mile from where I parked my truck. I like this one specific bend in the river, where the water slows down and gets deep. It's prime territory for flathead catfish. I set up my lantern, baited my lines with sunfish, and settled in for the night. Around 1 a.m., the woods went dead silent. If you spend time outdoors, you know that silence is louder than noise. The frogs stopped. The cicadas cut out. Even the wind seemed to die down. The only sound was the water lapping against the mud bank. I felt a sudden, intense pressure in my chest. It wasn't pain exactly. It felt like the air pressure had dropped 50 points in a second. I stood up to stretch and shine my light around. I got this feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just shadows and oak trunks. I decided to walk a little ways down the bank to relieve myself, getting away from my gear and the lantern light. I walked maybe 50 yards into the brush. The smell hit me first. It smelled like a slaughterhouse floor in the middle of summer. It was the heavy metallic scent of fresh blood mixed with bile and something rotting. I gagged. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and aimed my flashlight at the source. There was a huge, flat stump about 10 feet to my left. Sitting on top of it was a pile of meat. I stepped closer, thinking a poacher had gutted a deer and left the offal, but the shape was all wrong. It wasn't a chaotic pile of intestines. It was organized. There was a heart, lungs, and what looked like a stomach, all glistening wet and steaming in the night air. They were pulsing. The heart was beating. I could see the valves contracting. The lungs were inflating and deflating with a shallow, ragged rhythm. My brain couldn't process it. I stood there staring at this biological impossibility, trying to rationalize how a pile of organs could be alive outside of a body. I thought maybe I was hallucinating from heat exhaustion or fumes. I reached out with the barrel of my flashlight, thinking to poke it. A scream tore through the canopy above me. It wasn't a bobcat. It wasn't a mountain lion. It sounded like an old woman screaming while drowning. It was gurgling and high-pitched, a shriek that vibrated in my teeth. I whipped the light upward. Perched on a limb, about 20 feet up, was a great horned owl. But it was too big. It had to be 4 feet tall. Its feathers were matted and greasy. It looked down at me. The eyes weren't yellow avian eyes. They were human. They were brown with white sclera, and they were wide with panic and rage. The bird didn't fly. It fell from the branch. It dropped like a stone, spreading its wings at the last second to break its fall, landing heavily on the dead leaves between me and the stump. It stood up on 2 legs. The legs were feathered, but the knees were thick and knobby, like human knees covered in down. It hissed at me. The sound came from a beak that was hooked and sharp, but inside the beak, I saw a human tongue. I backed up. I didn't turn my back on it. I knew instinctively that if I turned, I was dead. The creature spread its wings out wide, trying to make itself look bigger, blocking the path to the stump. It snapped its beak, making a loud clack-clack noise. I remember a story my friend's grandfather told us when we were kids. He talked about the sticky knee. He said they were witches who vomited up their insides to turn into owls and fly around looking for hearts to eat. He said they had to hide their organs, and if anything happened to the organs, they couldn't turn back. This thing was protecting the pile on the stump. I stumbled backward over a root and fell hard on my ass. The creature lunged. It didn't fly, it hopped aggressively, closing the distance with terrifying speed. It looked clumsy but powerful, like a turkey vulture fighting over a carcass. I scrambled backward, kicking dirt at it. My hand landed on a heavy piece of driftwood. I swung it blindly. The wood connected with the bird's shoulder. It didn't feel like hitting a hollow-boned bird, though. It felt like hitting a solid bag of cement. The creature shrieked again, that same drowning woman scream, and recoiled. It flapped its wings, kicking up a cloud of dust and leaves, blinding me for just a second. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't go back for my rods or my lantern or anything. I just sprinted toward the truck. I could hear it crashing through the brush behind me. It was running. I could hear heavy footfalls and the sound of feathers brushing against the scrub oak. It sounded like a man running in a winter coat. I vaulted a fallen log and nearly twisted my ankle, but I didn't slow down. The adrenaline was the only thing keeping me moving. I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, fumbled for my keys, and had to get down to find them. I heard a swooping sound. I looked up and saw the silhouette of the owl against the stars. It was gliding over the truck, silent now. It landed on the hood of my pickup, right after I got inside. It stared at me through the windshield as I jammed the key into the ignition. Up close, in the dim light of the cab, I saw its face clearly. The feathers around the eyes were arranged in a pattern that looked like wrinkles. It looked ancient. It tapped on the glass with its beak. I cranked the engine and threw it into reverse. The bird held on for a second, its talons screeching against the metal of the hood, before it launched itself into the air. I drove back to Okmulgee doing 90. I didn't go home, though. I went to a 24-hour diner and sat in a booth near the back until the sun came up. I just didn't want to be alone. I was shaking so badly I couldn't hold a cup of coffee. I went back the next day in the daylight with 2 buddies and a shotgun. We went to the spot where I had been fishing. My gear was gone. My rods, my tackle box, my lantern, all of it. The mud bank was churned up and covered in weird 3-toed tracks that were too deep for a bird. We found the stump in the woods. The organs were gone, but the stump was stained dark with dried blood, and the wood was scorched, like someone had poured gasoline on it and lit a match. There was a smell hanging in the air that I can't describe. It smelled like burnt hair and ozone. It's safe to say I will never go back to that part of the woods. The River Walker. This happened about 5 years ago on the Penobscot River in Maine. 3 of us had decided to do a simple weekend paddle, put in near Medway, drift down a couple of miles, and camp on one of the little islands that dot the river. The plan was straightforward: paddle, fish, drink a few beers, sleep, repeat. Out there, it's mostly pine and birch. It's the kind of deep woods that make you feel like the rest of the world has just been put on mute. You see moose sometimes, bear if you are unlucky, but not a lot else. That afternoon, everything fell into place. We found a sandy spit that made for a perfect camp, set up a fire ring, and by dusk, the air smelled like smoke and wet pine. The river had gone glassy, reflecting the last of the orange sky so clearly it looked like we were camped between 2 sunsets. I turned in a little early. I'd gotten too much sun, and the combination of heat and cheap beer had left me feeling wrung out. I lay there in the tent, half asleep, listening to my friends laugh by the fire. Their voices came and went, weaving in with the gentle sound of the current and the occasional pop from the logs. It felt safe, ordinary. At some point around midnight, the laughing stopped. I didn't notice it right away. What woke me up fully was the silence. Not the good kind you get in the woods, where you can still hear insects and night birds, but a heavy, unnerving absence of sound. Just the current and the occasional crackle from the fire. No voices, no movement. Then I heard splashing. Most of the time out there, splashing is just fish breaking the surface or a beaver slapping its tail. You learn the sound palette of the river pretty quickly. This was different. It was heavier and more deliberate, a steady rhythm that sounded less like an animal and more like footsteps. Footsteps in water. I unzipped the tent and stuck my head out. The fire had burned down to a bed of red coals. My friends were sitting rigid in their camp chairs, shoulders locked, staring toward the river. I followed their gaze. Something was standing in the water. It was upright, waist deep, maybe 30 feet from shore. At first, I tried to make it into a moose because that would have been a relief, honestly. But it was too narrow, too tall. The shoulders were bony and angular, and the arms hung low, long and pale against the dark water. It looked like it had been pulled out of the river itself and stretched into the rough shape of a person. It was walking. It moved upstream against the current, one slow step at a time. The water broke around its chest in a smooth line, and there was almost no splash beyond what its legs displaced. It didn't lurch or stumble. It just progressed, steady and unbothered, like the flow of the river was nothing to it. We whispered to each other, just enough to confirm that we were all seeing the same thing. Nobody reached for a flashlight. We all had them within arm's reach, but some instinct cut across the three of us at the same time. If we lit it up, it would look back, and none of us wanted to know what it would mean to have its full attention. It kept moving, parallel to our camp. From where I was, I could clearly see the water breaking against its chest. The head was what really lodged in my mind. It was too small for the body, and tilted down, like it was staring into the riverbed, rather than looking ahead. It never once turned toward us. It passed directly in front of our camp. For maybe 20 seconds, we watched this thing walk through the current, steady and unchanging, like a looped piece of footage. It never paused, never hesitated, never gave any sign that it was aware of us at all. When it reached the far end of the island, it faded into shadow, swallowed up by the darkness and the bend in the river. We sat there waiting, listening for more splashes, for movement, for anything. Nothing came. None of us went back to sleep. We fed the fire high, not because we needed the light, but because it felt like the only barrier we had. Every ripple on the river made my stomach knot. Every small sound sent a shot of adrenaline through me. We didn't talk much. Honestly, I don't think we had language for it yet. When dawn finally came and the world turned gray instead of black, we moved. In daylight, it almost felt ridiculous to be so shaken. Almost. We checked the bank on our side first. There were our prints, our drag marks from the canoe, but nothing else. No sign that anything had come close to our camp from the water. Across the way, it was different. The mud over there looked disturbed, like something heavy had climbed out of the river. There were long, dragging marks, too wide to be deer, too clean and oddly shaped to be moose. They didn't look like any hoof or boot I've ever seen. We didn't spend a lot of time studying them. We packed fast, faster than we ever had on any other trip. The plan had been to fish and hang out another day, really soak in being off the grid. Instead, we pushed off and paddled downstream, not even pretending to fish. None of us wanted to linger. Since then, we've tried out labels. We've called it a cryptid, a spirit, even a hallucination we somehow shared. None of those really fit. What I know is this. Something walked upstream that night on the Penobscot River, in water that should have dragged at its legs, and it moved like the river belonged to it, and we did not. The Screamer in the Hollow by Matt L. I don't usually tell this story because it doesn't have a tidy ending, and it makes me sound like the kind of person who believes every ghost story is real. That's not who I am. I'm just a hunter who's spent years in the woods. This happened about 6 years ago outside Wytheville, Virginia, not far from Crawfish Valley. I was out for whitetail, and it was that damp early November cold that feels like it gets into your bones. I parked off a forestry road about 3 miles in, near an old fire trail that hadn't seen a truck in years. I planned to set up in a hollow overlooking a row of oaks where I'd seen signs the week before. Rubs, old scat, and a worn trail leading down to a creek. That morning, thick fog filled the hollow, turning everything a pale gray and making the woods feel smaller and quieter than usual. I'd been sitting there since just before dawn, without firing a shot or even seeing a squirrel. Around 9, I heard something on the ridge to my left. It wasn't the usual rustle or crunch. It was steady footsteps, too heavy for a deer, too smooth for a bear. When I shifted, it stopped, so I thought maybe it was another hunter that had come in from the other side. I quietly called out, "Hey there," just to be safe. No one answered. I listened for a while and the woods went quiet again. After a few minutes, I started packing up. The silence made me uneasy and I wasn't really seeing anything, so I decided to head down toward the creek to look for tracks before leaving, just to make the trip worth it. The fog was still thick, but I could see about 20 yards ahead. Every step sounded louder than usual, with leaves crunching under my boots. I could almost hear my heartbeat through my rifle. Halfway down the ridge, I caught the smell of rot that usually means there's a dead animal nearby. A wet, sweet, sour scent. I stopped and leaned against a tree, looking around. At first, I didn't see anything. And then I heard long, slow breaths, close enough that I expected to see something if the fog shifted. But the fog didn't move. I stepped back a few times, raising my rifle without thinking. I didn't aim, I just got ready. The breathing stopped. For about 10 seconds, everything was dead still. Then, from somewhere in the fog, a scream rang out. It wasn't quite human, but it was no animal that I know of either. It started low and then rose, and then broke into a laugh halfway through. My stomach turned, and every hair on my arm stood up. I can only say that it didn't sound like anything that should be in those woods. I turned and walked quickly back up toward the trail. The fog got even thicker as I climbed, almost like it was closing in behind me. I could hear footsteps matching mine from down in the hollow. When I stopped, they stopped. I tried to tell myself that it was just echoes, but I knew that that was not right. My hands shook so much I had to keep my finger along the trigger guard to keep from slipping. When I finally got out of the mist and saw my truck, it felt like stepping into a different day. The light was clear, and the trees looked normal again. I sat in the cab for a long time, listening. Nothing had followed me. I didn't hear another sound all morning, but just before I started the truck, I noticed something strange. There was a streak of wet mud across the back from one taillight to the other, like something had dragged a hand or a paw across it. But it wasn't really mud. It was like gray, like clay mixed with ash. And when I smelled it, it had that same rotten scent from the hollow. I drove out fast. You wouldn't think fog could hang that thick, but by the time I reached the main road, it was like somebody had drawn a line in the air, perfectly clear past a certain bend. I stopped in town for gas and told myself maybe it was a bobcat call that just echoed weird. I even looked up recordings. Some were close, but none had that pitch change in the middle, like laughter. A week later, I went back, not to hunt, but to see if I could figure out what happened. I didn't tell my buddies because I didn't want to hear their stupid jokes. The drive looked normal until I reached that same curve in the forestry road. After that, everything felt strange again. I parked in the same spot, got out, and just stood there. You can tell when a place doesn't want you around, and that's how it felt. The air even smelled a little burnt, like wet cedar after a fire. I walked about 100 yards before I found something that looked like a fire ring, but it was just a patch of black earth in a perfect circle, about 3 feet wide. There were no ashes or disturbed leaves, as if it had always been there. The center had a single drag mark, like something heavy had been pulled out. It was cold and damp, even though the sun had been out all morning. I didn't stick around. I left and haven't been back since. Still, every time I hunt within 50 miles of that place, I think about it. The smell, the noise, that laugh. I've talked to a few old-timers who said that hollow has always been thin. That's what they call places where things don't separate cleanly, where something from outside the normal can leak through. Some said people used to hear screaming down there at night in the 70s, but nobody ever found anything. I keep telling myself it was just a weird echo, or maybe an animal with some kind of throat injury, or that I startled a squatter and my mind filled in the rest. I think that's what you have to tell yourself to sleep at night. But sometimes when I'm butchering in the shed late at night, I think I hear breathing behind me. That same slow rhythm, the same hiss at the end of each breath. And when I turn around, of course, there's never anything there. The Haunted Cabin. I rented a secluded cabin near Lake Tahoe last winter after a brutal stretch of work and burnout. It was one of those listings advertised as perfect for solitude, which I realize now was a red flag disguised as a selling point. There were no neighbors, and cell service was pretty much non-existent. Just pines taller than buildings, and a lake that looked black once the sun dropped. The first 2 nights were pretty peaceful. Cold, but peaceful. I slept better than I had in months. No traffic or stupid notifications or noisy people. Just wind and trees. Night 3 was when the knocking started. It was around 1 in the morning. The sound was pretty soft at first. 3 knocks, slow and spaced apart. For a second, I thought it might be a woodpecker. I sat up and blinked into the darkness. The cabin had these big windows that faced the forest, but everything outside was pitch black. The nearest cabin was miles away. I didn't move, just tried to listen, and then it came again. 3 knocks in the same rhythm, from the same spot, the front door. I realized the knocking was too soft to be a woodpecker. Usually those things are louder than anything. They're very sharp knocks, but this was soft, like somebody was trying to be polite. I told myself all the stupid irrational things you tell yourself when you're trying to calm down. It was an animal, maybe a bear, maybe something brushed against the wood. But I knew in my heart that the knocks were too neat and intentional to be any of that. I got up and grabbed the flashlight and cracked the front door open. There was nothing out there, just trees and darkness and the faint hush of snow settling onto branches. The beam of my flashlight didn't catch eye shine or movement or anything. The porch was totally empty. I shut the door fast and locked it. The knocking did not come back that night, but the next night it did, this time at 12:47 a.m., which I remember because I checked the clock. It was the same precise 3 knocks. I tried to ignore it, pulled the covers over my head like a little kid, but it kept going every 10 minutes or so. Whatever it was patient and very persistent. At At one point, I heard what sounded like knuckles dragging slowly down the wood. By morning, I was exhausted. The third night, the knocking started earlier, 11:23 p.m. 3 knocks, and then a pause, and then 2 more closer together. I stood at the door for a long time, hand on the deadbolt. I don't know what I expected, but something in me needed to look. I opened the door in one quick motion. The forest stared back. My breath fogged in the freezing air, snow glittered around the porch, but nothing moved. And that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The knocking hadn't come from the door. It sounded like it came through it, like someone standing exactly where I was now. I shut the door slowly. That night, I slept on the couch with the fireplace lit. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Soft ones, barely there, like someone walking slowly across old wood, testing the boards. And then the knocking started again. But this time it was at the window. 3 soft taps, right at the glass behind me. My whole body went cold. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I stared at the fireplace, while my pulse banged in my ears. I finally forced myself to turn around. But all I saw was my own reflection, faintly superimposed over the darkness outside. The window pane frosted slightly at the bottom. But the tapping continued. Now it wasn't on the glass. It was on the wall beside it. A slow, wandering tap, like knuckles moving over something textured. I grabbed my keys and left before the sun was up. I didn't necessarily pack, I just threw everything together and into my car. I didn't check out. I just drove until my phone finally got signal. When I called the rental owner, I didn't tell him all the details, just that something about the cabin didn't feel safe. He sighed, not in a way that would suggest he was mocking me or anything, but almost in a way that made it obvious I wasn't the first person to say that. About a week after returning home, the owner finally emailed me. In my rush, I had left some things behind, which of course I figured out after I got home. At that point, I figured they could keep it, but he did say the cleaning crew found all my stuff untouched, except for one thing. My jacket was folded neatly on the couch, and sitting on top of it, in the dead center, was a small pile of snow, right where my head had been the night the tapping reached the window. I don't know what it means, but I don't want that jacket back either way. Someone Walked My Campsite Before I Did, by Jordan K. This was on the Mogollon Rim in Arizona, up near where the forest starts feeling like an actual forest instead of decorative green around a highway. If you've never been up there, it's strangely abrupt. You drive through scrub and heat, and then suddenly you're in tall pines and the air smells like sap and damp dirt, like somebody opened a different room. I went solo for one night, which I do sometimes because I like not talking and not compromising on pace. It wasn't some hardcore through hike. It was just a short backpack in, set up before dark, make ramen, sleep, walk out in the morning, and pretend I'm an outdoors person again. I parked off a forest road outside Payson. The lot was half full, but it was a weekend and the weather was good. People love that area when it's not on fire. I picked a trail that ran along the top of the rim. No big elevation gains, mostly rolling. The kind of hike where the hard part is keeping your attention from drifting because everything looks the same until you get a view. About an hour in, I started noticing footprints. Not just any footprints, like boot prints with a clear tread pattern, fresh enough that they still had sharp edges where the dirt crumbled. This caught my eye because the ground wasn't wet. It was that dry, fine soil that holds an impression if you step hard, but it also blurs fast if wind moves through. I figured maybe somebody had passed earlier in the day. Normal, lots of people hike there. Except I wasn't seeing two sets of tracks like a typical hiker. I was seeing one set, single file and evenly spaced. Left, right. No wandering or pausing or scuffs. Almost too consistent. Again, not paranormal at this point, just specific. I kept going, and the prints kept showing up in patches. Sometimes they disappeared where the trail hit rock, and then they'd be back in the next sandy stretch. They weren't animal prints, too long and too boot-shaped. I remember thinking, okay, I'm behind someone who's walking the same speed as me, and that's mildly annoying, because I don't want to play the awkward passing game on a narrow trail. So I sped up a little. I never caught up to anyone. There were no voices ahead, no backpack silhouette between trees, no movement at all, really. Just those prints appearing like the trail was laying them down for me. At a certain point, the trail widened near a viewpoint. You can see forever from some of those spots, just layers of green and blue ridges fading out, with the canyon dropping off in front of you. I stopped there and drank water, sat on a rock, took a couple of pictures I never posted because they look like every other Arizona pine photo. While I sat, I watched the trail ahead. Nothing. When I got up, I noticed the prints were around the rock I'd been sitting on, like whoever made them had stood there too, in the same spot, the same angle toward the canyon. I told myself I was being dramatic. It's easy to be dramatic when you're alone in the woods and it's quiet. Your brain wants a story and it hates random. I moved on and started looking for a campsite. There are a bunch of unofficial sites up there, little clearings where people have clearly been setting up for years. Flat ground, fire ring, logs dragged into a circle. Some are right off the trail, but some are tucked back a bit. I found one that looked perfect. Not too exposed, not right on top of the trail, soft enough ground for my tent. There was even a deadfall log I could use as a seat. It felt like a win. And then I saw the footprints again. They didn't just lead past it. They cut off the trail, went straight into the clearing, circled the fire ring, and went over to the exact spot where I was about to pitch my tent. And then they just stopped. There was no return track, no exit route, just a clean end, like the person got there and stepped out of reality. I stood there holding my pack straps, staring at that last impression in the dirt. My first thought was that somebody had camped there earlier and left, and the prints only showed the approach because the exit path was on rock or pine needles where it didn't leave a mark. So I looked around for the exit. The ground around the end of the tracks was soft dirt. You could leave prints walking to the log, to the fire ring, to the trees. Nothing. No second set going out. No scuffs or drag marks, just the approach and then this weird abrupt stop at the most logical tent spot. I didn't like that feeling. It was like my brain was trying to solve something, but couldn't. It made me feel small in a way that's hard to explain. Like the world was running a little different than I assumed it should, and I didn't have the user manual. I should have picked out another site right then, but that's easy to tell myself now. Instead, I did the stubborn thing and set up anyway, because the clearing was good, and I didn't want to let a weird set of prints make decisions for me. Also, it was getting later. The light shifts fast up there. 1 minute, you've got plenty of time. Next minute, everything is gray and the shadows are thick. I pitched my tent with that low-level tension in my body that you ignore until it becomes a headache. I made ramen on my little stove. I ate sitting on the log. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see the person who made the prints just casually walk in like, "Oh, hey, sorry, this is my spot." Nobody came. The forest was normal. The birds got quiet as the sun dropped. Wind moved through the pines. Somewhere far off, I heard a couple people on the trail, voices carrying and then fading. The prints stayed there in the dirt beside my tent, like they were waiting. I crawled into the tent around 9:30. I wasn't sleepy, but there wasn't anything else to do, and I really didn't want to sit out there in the dark thinking about footprints. I read on my phone until the battery made me feel guilty, and then I turned it off and listened. At first, it was just normal night sounds, small stuff, branches creaking, a faint rustle of something in needles, the occasional distant call of something I couldn't quite identify because I'm not a wildlife guy. And then sometime after midnight, I heard steps. Not far off in the woods, or leaves crunching. I heard the specific soft thud of boots on dirt, close enough that the ground transmitted it. It sounded like someone walking around my campsite. I sat up inside my tent so fast my sleeping bag twisted around my legs. I listened, trying to map the sound. It circled. It paused near the fire ring. It moved toward the log. And then it stopped, right outside my tent. I could hear breathing. Not loud, but present. It was like somebody was standing still. I held my own breath without meaning to. My heart was doing that thick pounding thing that makes your throat feel tight. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight, but I also didn't want to open a flap between me and whatever was out there. Both thoughts existed at the same time, and neither won. A few seconds passed, maybe longer. Then, from right outside the tent, I heard the sound of fabric shifting, like someone crouching and leaning close. The tent wall barely moved, just a subtle pressure against it, like a hand resting there. Not pushing, not testing the zipper, just touching. I stayed frozen, staring at the nylon like I could see through it if I stared hard enough. And then, I heard something that messed me up more than footsteps ever could. I heard my own voice, not speaking from inside the tent, speaking from outside, in the same direction as the breathing. It wasn't a full sentence. It was just a short sound, like a little laugh or a soft, "yeah," the kind of noise you make when you're acknowledging someone in conversation. I didn't make that noise. I didn't move or react. My brain went into this blank mode where it refuses to process anything because processing would mean committing to a reality that I didn't want. There was another sound outside, like the person shifted their weight. The pressure on the tent wall eased, and then the footsteps resumed, circling away unhurried. They didn't fade like someone walking deeper into the woods. They faded like someone walking into a room as the door slowly closed. After that, the forest went quiet in a way that almost felt staged, muted, like somebody had turned the volume down. I did not sleep. I lay there until my body started aching from being so tense. I checked my phone a few times, even though I didn't want the light. Time crawled. Around 4:30, I started hearing birds again. It was that early morning shift, where the world restarts. I waited until there was enough light to see shapes, and then I got out. The campsite looked normal. The tent was not torn. There were no footprints in the pine needles, except in the dirt by my tent, where the earlier prints had stopped. There was a new set. They were the same tread pattern as before, the same spacing and clean edges. They circled my tent once, like someone had walked a careful loop around me during the night. and then they went straight to the trail and continued on. I followed them for a bit, because apparently I am not smart. They led down the trail like a person heading somewhere with confidence. I kept expecting them to veer off or disappear again, but they didn't. They just kept going, steady and neat, until the trail hit rock and I lost them. I went back and packed up fast. Not frantic, but fast. No breakfast, no hanging around. I hiked out. But here's the part that makes me feel stupid when I try to tell it, because it sounds like I'm trying to force meaning into it or something. But when I got back to my car, there was dust on the driver's side window, like somebody had leaned a hand there. I wiped it off with my sleeve and it didn't fully come away. It just spread. I drove home with the windows up, even though it was warm. The Redwood Cough by Sarah M. I'm a regular hiker. I grew up in Northern California, and I've spent more nights in the backcountry of the Humboldt-Toyabe area and the Redwoods than I have in my own bed some years. I'm not the type to get spooked by a snapping twig or a mountain lion scream. I know what the woods sound like at 3 a.m. But what happened last October near the Lost Coast Trail was not a mountain lion. I was 3 days into a solo trip. I had set up camp in a dense stand of old-growth trees, maybe 4 miles off the main spur. The terrain there is vertical and thick with ferns that grow chest-high. It's beautiful, but it's the kind of place where you realize how quickly the forest could swallow you. The sun went down and the fog rolled in off the Pacific. It was thick enough to dampen all the sound. I was sitting by my stove, waiting for my water to boil, when I heard a cough. It sounded like a human cough. Specifically, it sounded like my dad's cough, a dry, hacking sound he makes because of his asthma. It came from the tree line maybe 20 feet past the edge of my headlamp's reach. I froze. You didn't expect to hear another person out there. Especially not someone who sounds exactly like your family who you know is not out there. I called out a, "Hello?" But just the sound of the fog dripping off the needles answered me. I figured it was my mind playing tricks. Auditory pareidolia is a real thing when you're alone in the woods. But then I heard it again, closer. And it wasn't just the cough, there was a voice. And it whispered my name. I've read other stories where people say it sounded like a recording, but this didn't sound like a recording. It sounded like something was trying to form the word for the first time, using some kind of biology that wasn't built for it. The S was too long, like a whistle. I grabbed my bear spray and stood up. I aimed my light toward the sound. The beam cut through the mist, and for a second, I saw legs behind a massive redwood trunk. They were gray and hairless, like the skin of a shark. They were too long for a person, maybe 5 feet from the hip to the ground, and the knees were bent backward. I backed up toward my tent, keeping the light on that tree. The thing stepped out. It looked like it had tried to put on a human costume, but got everything wrong. It had the general shape of a person, but it was leaning forward at an angle that no human could without falling. It was wearing a piece of what looked to be deer hide, but the hide seemed to be fused to its own skin. The worst part was the face. It didn't have eyes, just deep, dark pits. And the mouth was a vertical slit that went from the nose down to the neck. It didn't attack. It just stood there in the fog and started mimicking the sound of my stove's boiling water. It made a rhythmic bubbling hiss. Then it transitioned back into my dad's voice. "Sarah, it's cold. It took a step into my camp, and the way that it moved was wrong. It didn't lift its feet. It slid them through the dirt like it was skating. I reached into my pack and grabbed my signaling air horn and let it rip. The blast was deafening in the quiet woods. But the creature didn't even flinch. It just watched me. And then it opened that vertical mouth and let out the exact same air horn blast, only louder. I didn't stay to pack. I grabbed my boots and my jacket and I ran. I didn't care about the cliffs or the darkness. I could hear it behind me the whole time, but it wasn't chasing me. It was keeping a consistent distance, staying just at the edge of my vision. I know that thing could have caught me if it wanted to. Every few minutes, it would cough. I made it back to my truck at the trailhead by dawn. I drove 3 hours before I realized I was still holding the bear spray so tight that my knuckles were white. I haven't been back to that part of the coast. The weirdest part of it wasn't the sighting, though. It was that my dad called me the next day. He told me he'd had a dream that night where he was standing in the woods, calling for me because he was cold and had lost his breath. The animal cry. This happened to me about 3 years ago, and I still can't shake it. I was doing a solo backpacking trip through the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. It was one of those find yourself in nature kind of deals after a rough breakup. I'd been hiking for 2 days, maybe 15 miles, deep into the Hoh River area, where cell service is non-existent and you might not see another human for days. The first night was fine. Set up camp near a creek, heard the usual owl hoots and rustling that you would expect. But the second day, around 3 in the afternoon, I was following this game trail that branched off from the main path. I wanted to find a good spot to camp for the night, somewhere with water access but away from the established sites. That's when I heard, well, whatever it was. The sound, I don't even know how to describe it properly. It was kind of like deer or elk, but making this absolutely heartbreaking cry. You know that sound animals make when they're hurt or trapped? High-pitched and desperate and almost human-like in how much pain it conveyed? It was a little bit like that. It made my stomach drop immediately. I stopped dead in my tracks and listened. The cry came again, maybe 200 yards ahead of me through the trees. It was constant, not the kind of intermittent calling you'd hear from a healthy animal. This thing was in serious distress. Now, I'm not some bleeding heart who goes running toward every wounded animal I encounter, but this sound was so pitiful, so completely miserable, that I felt compelled to at least check it out. Maybe it was caught in a trap or tangled in wire. I've seen that before, and sometimes you can actually help without getting yourself killed. I dropped my pack and pulled out my knife, just in case. I started moving toward the sound, trying to step quietly on the moss and fallen needles. The Olympic forests are thick as heck. Huge Douglas firs and western hemlocks creating this cathedral-like canopy that blocks out most of the light, even in the middle of the day. Ferns everywhere, fallen logs covered in moss, and that perpetual dampness that makes everything smell like decay and growth at the same time. The crying continued as I got closer. Same pitch, same rhythm, like a broken record. But here's the thing that really started bothering me. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Sound travels strangely in dense forest. It bounces off trees and gets all distorted. But this was different. Every time I thought I was getting close, it seemed to shift slightly. After maybe 10 minutes of careful movement, I realized I still hadn't seen any sign of an animal. No broken branches or disturbed undergrowth or tracks. And the sound hadn't got any louder, despite me definitely moving in the right direction. I stopped and really listened. The crying was still there, but it seemed fainter, like it was moving away from me as I approached. And that's when the hair on my neck started standing on end. I actually called out, "Hey, are you okay?" Which I know sounds stupid, but sometimes injured animals will respond to human voices, give you a better idea of their location and condition. The crying stopped immediately. Complete silence except for the distant drip of condensation from the canopy above. And then it started again, but from a completely different direction. Behind me and to the left, maybe about 100 yards away. Same exact sound. That desperate, pained wailing. I turned around and started walking back toward where I'd dropped my pack, but slowly and listening. The sound followed me. Not like an animal following me, but like the sound itself was tracking my movement. When I stopped, it continued for a few more seconds and then stopped too. When I started walking again, it resumed. This went on for probably 20 minutes. I'd move in one direction, the sound would come from somewhere else. I would change course, it would shift again. Always just out of sight. Always just far enough away that I couldn't get a visual on whatever was making it. By this point, my rational brain was trying to come up with explanations. Maybe it was echoes bouncing off the rock faces that are scattered throughout that area. Maybe there were multiple animals and I was hearing different ones. Maybe the acoustics of the forest were just playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something that made my blood go cold. The sound was getting more and more human-like. What had started as an animal cry was gradually developing these subtle inflections, these tonal qualities that reminded me of a person trying to mimic an animal, rather than an actual animal in distress. I've heard injured deer before. I've heard elk calls and bear vocalizations, even mountain lion screams, which do completely sound like a woman screaming. But this was starting to sound like none of those things. This was starting to sound like someone sitting in the woods, making animal noises with their mouth. That's when I decided I was done with this whole situation. I jogged back to where I'd left my pack, grabbed it without even putting it on properly, and started hustling back toward the main trail. The sound followed me for maybe another 10 minutes or so, always staying just out of sight, always maintaining that same distance. And then it just stopped. I hiked until almost dark that day, putting as much distance as possible between me and whatever the hell that was. I ended up camping right next to the main trail, which is something I never do because of the foot traffic, but I wanted to be somewhere other hikers might pass by. Nothing else happened that night, or the next day when I hiked out. But I've been thinking about it ever since, and I keep coming back to a few things that just don't sit right. First, the sound never changed in intensity or quality despite me moving around for over an hour. An injured animal would show some variation, getting weaker maybe, or changing pitch as its condition deteriorated. This was identical, every single time. Second, no animal I know of can project its voice like that, making it seem like it's coming from different locations. And the timing was too perfect. It would start and stop in response to my movements, like it was watching me. Third, and this is the part that really gets to me, I never saw any wildlife that entire day. Not a bird, not a squirrel, nothing. The forest was completely silent, except for that crying. In an area that's usually crawling with life, I encountered nothing, and the absence is really what terrifies me. It kept repeating. So basically, this happened to me like 3 months ago, and honestly, I still have no idea what to think. I keep thinking maybe I shouldn't even post this because it sounds kinda crazy, but I just need to put it out there and see if anyone else had something like this happen. So I went on this solo backpacking trip in Olympic National Park in Washington State. I'd been trying to get a permit for months. You know how annoying that is. I finally got one for a 3-day hike in the Hoh River area. The first day was totally normal. I set up my tent by the river, heard some elk making weird noises far away, just regular Pacific Northwest stuff. Day 2 is where things got weird. I packed up around 7 in the morning and started walking on what I thought was the main trail, going deeper into the woods. It was super foggy, which is normal there, but this fog just felt weird, like thicker and heavier. I remember thinking it was kinda creepy that I couldn't hear any birds, or really any sounds at all. After about 2 hours, I saw this huge fallen cedar tree across the trail. It was massive, like 8 feet wide, and covered in bright green moss. There was a path around it on the left, so I just went that way and kept walking. The fog was finally starting to go away a little by then. This is where it started getting weird. Like an hour later, I ran into the exact same fallen tree. Same moss, same everything. I just stood there staring at it for a while because I knew for sure I hadn't turned around or taken any side trails. I had just been following the path the whole time. I thought maybe I got turned around in the fog, even though my compass was still pointing north the whole time. So I went around the tree again, but this time I was really watching everything and checking my GPS every few minutes. The GPS is what really started to freak me out. It said I was moving along the trail just fine. The little dot was going forward, but when I got to that same tree for the 3rd time, the GPS said that I was in a totally different spot than before. By now, it was almost noon, and I was starting to panic a bit. I had enough food and water for 3 days, but I was supposed to get to a campsite by evening, and at this rate, I was just stuck. I tried yelling to see if anyone else was around, but my voice just disappeared into the trees. The 4th time I saw the tree, I decided to mark it. I took out my knife and carved a little X into the bark on the side facing the path. Then I went around it again, but this time I was basically obsessed with every little thing on the trail. I counted my steps, looked at every weird rock or root, and tried to remember how the trees looked above me. When I got to the fallen cedar for the 5th time, my X was just gone. The bark was totally smooth, like I never even touched it. And that's when I really started freaking out. I sat down on a nearby stump and tried to think rationally about what was happening. Maybe I had altitude sickness, though we weren't that high up. Maybe I was dehydrated or having some kind of medical episode. I checked my phone, no signal, which was expected, and my watch, to make sure I wasn't losing time somehow. Everything seemed normal, except for the fact that I kept ending up at this weird tree. For the 6th attempt, I decided to ignore the obvious path around the tree and instead climbed over the trunk itself. It was awkward with my pack, and I scraped up my shins pretty badly, but I made it over. The trail continued on the other side, just like before. This time felt different, though. The forest seemed quieter, if that makes sense, and the light filtering through the canopy had a strange, almost greenish quality. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the fallen tree reappearing behind me. About 45 minutes later, I heard running water ahead. The relief was incredible because running water meant I was getting closer to the Hoh River, which allowed me to reorient myself. But when I pushed through the undergrowth toward the sound, I found myself standing next to the same fallen cedar tree I'd been encountering all day. Only this time, there was no tree. Like, the spot where the tree should have been was just empty ground, but you could see where something huge had fallen, with broken branches and messed up dirt everywhere. It was like the tree just disappeared. I just stood there for like 20 minutes trying to figure out what I was even looking at. Then I saw something that really freaked me out. There were footprints in the dirt where the tree should have been. My own footprints, from all the times I had walked around it. But they made this weird pattern, like they were circling something that wasn't there anymore. I got the hell out of there. Didn't matter which direction the trail was supposed to go. I just picked a direction and started hiking as fast as I could. I used my GPS to navigate toward what looked like the nearest road, even if it meant cutting through unmarked forest. It took me 6 hours to fight through the woods to finally reach a logging road, and then I hiked out to my car. The whole drive home, I just kept thinking about those footprints and the missing tree. I reported the incident to the Park Service when I got back to Seattle, mainly because I was worried other hikers might get lost in the same area. The ranger I spoke with was polite, but clearly thought I had just gotten disoriented. He mentioned that the fog can play tricks on people, and that the forest can look very similar in different areas. Whatever. But here's what still gets me. A week later, I was looking at my photos from the trip, and in one of them from the first day near my campsite, you can see a huge fallen cedar tree in the background. Same moss and everything. The GPS on the photo says that tree was like 3 miles from where I kept seeing it on day 2. Since then, I've looked up a bunch of stories like this, and there are actually a lot of people who say they got stuck in these loops in forests around the Pacific Northwest. Most people just say they got lost, but some of the stuff they talk about is weird. I don't really know what happened, but it happened to me. I found a footprint that wasn't human. By Emily. I was hiking early in the morning after a pretty light rain, so the ground was perfect for seeing tracks. It's something of a hobby of mine. I just like to see all the different tracks of the wildlife that's out on my hikes. I had noticed a couple of birds and a deer, and it was pretty cool. But then I noticed a footprint next to mine that did not match any animal I knew. It was long and narrow, almost like a human foot, but the heel was wrong and the toes were all stretched out. At first I thought maybe it was my boot print and it had smeared, so I stepped next to it to compare. My footprint looked normal, and the other one definitely was not from a shoe. I followed the trail of prints for a few steps until they just stopped in the middle of the path. There was no scuffing or exit or anything like that. It was like they just got picked up from the planet in the middle of the road. I was crouched down to look at it, but then I just got this strong feeling that I should not be crouched down right there. So I stood up and kept walking. I tried not to panic or run or look around too much. I still wish I had taken a photo, but I'm glad I didn't stop for longer at the same time, because I just got this primal feeling like something did not want me there. I saw something in the Porcupine Mountains that was not a bear. By Marcus T. So this happened in October 2023, and I still don't know what to make of it. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just putting it out there because I need to tell someone who isn't going to look at me like I've lost it. I'd been planning this trip to the Porcupines for months. The Porcupine Mountains are way up in the western Upper Peninsula, right on Lake Superior. It's proper wilderness up there, not the kind of state park where you're sharing trails with strollers and people walking their dogs. I wanted to do the Lake of the Clouds overlook and then hike down into the valley, maybe camp near the Carp River. I'd done plenty of solo trips before. I'm comfortable in the woods. I know what I'm doing. The weather was perfect that first day. Cold but clear, leaves mostly down. I got to the overlook around noon and, yeah, it's as gorgeous as everyone says. The escarpment drops off and you can see the whole valley stretched out below. All these ridges covered in forest going on forever. Took my photos, ate a sandwich, started down. The trail gets steep, fast. Your knees feel it. But it's well marked and I made good time. I was planning to camp somewhere along the river that night and then loop back the next day. By 4 or so, I found a decent spot. Flat ground near the water, a good distance from the trail. I set up my tent and got my bear hang sorted and made dinner, standard stuff. I'm not going to say I heard something weird that night because I didn't. I slept fine and woke up around 7 when it was light enough to see. And that's when things got strange. My campsite looked normal. Everything was where I had left it. But there were tracks in the dirt around my tent that definitely had not been there the night before. Big tracks. I'm talking probably 14 inches long, maybe more. They were shaped wrong for bear tracks, though. Bears have that distinctive toe pattern, and these were different. The toes were longer. The overall shape was more human-like, but scaled up. I've seen bear tracks plenty of times. These weren't bear tracks. I told myself it was probably just a weird print. Maybe where a bear stepped funny on the dirt, or the dirt was soft in a way that distorted things. I took a few pictures on my phone. The prints circled my tent maybe twice, and then headed off toward the river. I should have packed up right then, I know that now. But it was broad daylight and I felt stupid for being nervous about some footprints. I made coffee, broke down camp, and started hiking. The plan was to follow the river east for a few miles and then cut back up to the ridge trail. It's beautiful down in that valley. The Carp River is this dark tea color from all the tannins, and it moves fast over the rocks. Lots of old-growth hemlocks. Really quiet except for the water. Around mid-morning, I stopped to filter water from the river. I was crouched down by the bank, pump filter going, when I got this feeling. You know the one, like someone's watching you. I looked up and scanned the trees across the river, maybe 40 feet away. There was something standing there. It was behind a big hemlock, but I could see that it was tall, taller than a person. The proportions were wrong for a bear standing up. It was too narrow and upright. I couldn't see details because of the shadows and the tree trunk blocking out most of it, but I could see enough to know that it wasn't moving like an animal. It was just standing there, still, watching me. My brain was doing this thing where it kept trying to make it into something normal. A stump, a shadow, some trick of the light, but I was looking right at it, and whatever it was looking back at me. I could feel it. I don't remember deciding to leave. I just remember my hands unscrewing the filter, shoving it in my pack, and standing up. Some part of me knew that running would be bad, but I walked back fast the way I'd come, and I didn't look behind me until I had put maybe a quarter mile between me and that spot. I hiked out that day instead of staying a second night. I told myself that I just wasn't feeling it, that I'd come back another time, but I have not been back. The thing is, I've been trying to research this since I got home. There are some stories about something in the UP called the Michigan Dog Man, but that's supposed to be more canine, and what I saw seemed more ape-like. Some people talk about Bigfoot sightings in the area. I don't know what I think about any of that. I just know that what I saw was not a bear, and it wasn't a person, and it moved in a way that made my stomach drop. I still have the photos of the tracks on my phone. I've shown them to exactly 2 people, both friends who camp. One said it was definitely a bear, just at a weird angle. The other one looked at them for a long time, and then handed my phone back and never said anything. I'm not going to say that it was definitely a cryptid or whatever. I'm just saying that I saw something in the woods that I can't explain, and I have no interest in going back to find out what it was. I Think I Know Why the Logging Road Was Closed, by Sarah. I worked for the Washington Department of Natural Resources last summer, doing trail maintenance for the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. It was my second season, and I thought I knew what to expect. Long days hiking in with equipment, clearing fallen trees, fixing erosion damage. Mostly solo work once you got assigned your section. In late July, they sent me out to work on a trail near the Lewis River. There's this old logging road that branches off Highway 90, goes about 8 miles back into the forest before it dead ends at what used to be a staging area. The road's been officially closed since 2019, but the gate's always getting broken or left open by hunters and off-roaders. My supervisor told me to hike in from the highway instead of driving the logging road. She said the road was in pretty bad shape, and it wasn't worth risking a vehicle. Made sense at the time. I got to the trailhead around 7 in the morning. It was already warm, probably going to hit 80 by afternoon. The trail runs parallel to the logging road for the first 2 miles, close enough that you can see the road through the trees in some spots. About an hour in, I stopped to drink some water, and I heard a vehicle. It sounded like a truck, coming up the logging road from deeper in the forest, heading toward the highway. I didn't think much of it. People ignore closure signs all the time. But then I heard it stop. The engine cut out maybe a quarter mile ahead of me, right where the trail and the road come closest together. I kept walking. I figured somebody was turning around or taking a break. But when I got to that spot, I could see the road clearly through the gap in the trees, and there was no vehicle. There was nobody there at all. The engine had sounded so close, like right there close, and I hadn't heard it start up again or drive away. I stood there for a few minutes, just looking at the empty road. The dirt was dry, and I could see tire tracks from something recent, but that could have been from days ago. There was no fresh dust in the air, no sounds except birds and wind in the trees. I kept going. My work section started another mile up the trail. I spent most of the day clearing deadfall and reinforcing a washed-out section with rocks and drainage bars. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard the truck again. It was the same engine sound coming from the same direction, coming up the logging road from the interior. This time, I was close enough to the road that I could have walked over in 2 minutes. I dropped my tools and pushed through the brush to get a good look. Nothing. Empty road, but I could hear it. The engine was idling somewhere close, that low rumble of a diesel. I could even hear the slight variation in the RPMs, like someone had their foot on the accelerator. Then it started moving again. The sound got louder, like it was coming toward me. and then it passed my position and continued toward the highway. I watched the section of the road where it should have appeared, and nothing drove by. The sound faded into the distance and then cut out completely, like someone had turned a key. I went back to work, but I kept my radio on my belt instead of in my pack. We're supposed to check in with base every 4 hours, and I was thinking about calling early just to hear another human voice. Around 5, I started hiking back out. I'd gone maybe half a mile when I found a deer. It was lying across the trail. A doe, maybe 2 years old, completely intact, no visible injuries or blood or anything, but its eyes were open and clouded over. It had been dead for at least a day based on how stiff it was. The weird part was its position. It was lying on its side, with its legs straight out, like it had just tipped over while standing. Deer do not die like that. When they get hit by cars or taken down by predators, there's violence to it. Thrashing. This one looked like someone had carefully placed it there. I stepped over it and kept walking. Then I found another one. A buck, this time, bigger. Same thing though, lying on its side across the trail, legs straight out, no injuries, with its eyes clouded over. Before I got back to the highway, I counted 6 more. All of them positioned the same way. All of them placed directly on the trail, like someone wanted them to be found. When I got back to my truck, I called my supervisor and told him what I'd seen. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if I had seen the thing that killed them. I said I hadn't seen anything kill them, they just looked dead. He told me to take the next day off. He said he would send a wildlife team out to check on the deer, and they'd let me know if I needed to move to a different section. That was 6 weeks ago. Nobody ever called me back about it. When I checked the work schedule the following week, my assignment had been changed to a trail near Mount Adams, 30 miles away. The Lewis River Trail was marked as closed for the rest of the season. I asked another ranger about it when I ran into him at the station. He got this look on his face and told me the logging road's been problematic for years. Equipment malfunctions, people reporting engine sounds when there are no vehicles, deer found dead on the trails with no clear cause. He said the department keeps closing it and people keep breaking in. He said maybe they should just gate it with concrete barriers and forget it exists. I looked up the history of the area last week. There was a logging accident in 1987. A truck went off the road about 7 miles in and rolled down an embankment. Killed the driver. They recovered the vehicle, but they had to use a helicopter because the road was too narrow for a tow truck to turn around. The ranger I talked to said that sometimes areas just go bad. He said the forest does what it wants and we're just trying to manage around it. I don't know what I heard out there. I don't know what killed those deer or why they were arranged like that. But I am not going back to that trail. The department can send someone else. I found a campfire that was already burning. I was hiking way off the main trails, far enough that I hadn't seen another person all day. As I came over a small rise, I saw a campfire burning in a clearing ahead of me. It wasn't like old embers or something, but actual flames. They were steady, like they were being maintained. I waited for someone to speak up, but the clearing was completely empty. I didn't see any packs or a tent or food. It was just a clean fire ring and stacked wood. The fire popped like it had been burning for a while, so I knew it hadn't been freshly lit. I called out once and immediately regretted it, because something about the way the sound fell was just wrong. After a minute, I kicked dirt over the flames and backed away. I smelled smoke behind me for the whole rest of the hike out, but when I reached the road, my clothes didn't smell like smoke at all. The Ranger Station Nobody Uses Anymore by Tyler W. I worked for the Forest Service in Montana for 6 years before I quit last month. I am not going back. I don't care that I walked away from a pension and benefits and a career that I actually liked. What happened at the old McKenzie Creek Station was enough to make me rethink everything. McKenzie Creek is in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, about 40 miles northeast of Missoula. It's serious backcountry. You can hike for 3 days and not see another human being. The Forest Service maintains a few ranger stations out there for personnel doing extended surveys or managing the trail system, stuff like that. The McKenzie Creek Station was built in the 1960s. Standard construction for that era. Single-room cabin with a wood stove, small kitchen area, 2 bunk beds, an outhouse about 20 yards away. There's a newer station about 8 miles west that most rangers use now. It's a way better location. It has solar panels and proper radio equipment. And the McKenzie Station is technically still in rotation, but most people avoid it if they can. Now, I'd heard stories about the place, but I didn't put a whole lot of stock in them. Rangers talk, especially when you're out in the woods for weeks at a time with nothing but your own thoughts. Every old cabin has ghost stories, you know? Last September, I got assigned to a 2-week survey of the trail system in that sector. Routine maintenance check before winter. The newer station was already occupied, so my supervisor told me I'd be using McKenzie Creek. I hiked in on a Monday morning. Took me about 7 hours with all my gear. The station looked rough from the outside. The roof had some moss growing on it, and one of the windows had a crack running diagonally across the glass. But the door was solid, and the interior was dry. Good enough. I dropped my pack and started getting set up. The bunks had bare mattresses that smelled like mildew. There was a stack of firewood by the stove that looked like it had been there for years. A shelf with some old paperbacks and a few rusted cans of soup. A logbook on the small table where rangers were supposed to record their stays. I flipped through the logbook. The last entry was from April, 8 months earlier. Before that, nothing since October of the previous year. People really were avoiding this place. I made dinner on my camp stove and went through my survey maps. My plan was to spend the next 13 days hiking different sections, then hike back out on the Sunday. Standard work. That first night, I woke up at about 3 a.m. to the sound of the door opening. It wasn't like somebody was trying to be quiet about it either. The door just swung open, hinges creaking, and then it stayed open. I could see moonlight coming through the doorway. I got up and closed it. I checked the latch, which seemed fine, and went back to bed. 20 minutes later, it happened again. The door swung open and moonlight flooded in. I closed it again, and this time I dragged my pack over and I wedged it against the door. I went back to sleep. In the morning, the pack was still against the door, and the door was still closed. I figured maybe the latch was looser than I thought, and the wind had been catching it, even though I didn't remember feeling any wind. I spent that day hiking a 12-mile section of trail. I came back at about 6 p.m. The door was open. I stood there looking at this for a while, trying to work out the physics. I had placed another heavy pack sort of in front of the door. It's just enough so I could get out. There was no way the door could swing outward, with the pack blocking it from the inside as far as it went. But it was open, like fully open, and the pack was exactly where I'd left it. It literally would have had to have gone through the pack to do that. I went inside and checked everything. My gear was untouched, the food was secure in the bear box outside. Nothing had been disturbed. I ate dinner and wrote up my notes from the day's survey. Around 9 p.m., I started hearing footsteps on the roof. Clear, distinct footsteps. Boot heels on wooden shingles, walking from one end of the cabin to the other, and then back again. I went outside with my flashlight. There was nothing on the roof, no animals or branches or anything that could make that sound. I went back inside, and the footsteps started again immediately, pacing back and forth, right above where I was sitting. I tried to ignore it. I put in my earbuds and I listened to music until I was tired enough to sleep. The next morning, I checked the logbook again. I read through it more carefully this time. Most entries were pretty standard. Trail conditions, wildlife sightings, weather notes. But there were a few that stood out. An entry from 2018. Something keeps opening the door at night. Need to fix the latch. An entry from 2016. Heard walking on the roof both nights. Maybe a bear, but couldn't find any tracks. An entry from 2012. Can't sleep here. Moving to the Western Station tomorrow. Don't care what Henderson says about the damn schedule. That last one had been written by a ranger named Carl Morrison. I knew Carl. He had retired a few years back. Tough guy. Former Marine, not the type to spook easily at all. I decided to stick it out. I had a job to do, and I wasn't going to let an old cabin psych me out. The door kept opening. Every single night. Sometimes multiple times. I stopped wedging things against it and just let it happen. I figured I would get more sleep that way. The footsteps on the roof became routine. They would start at about 9 p.m. and continue until about midnight. Always the same pattern. End to end, back and forth. On the fifth night, I woke up to someone sitting on the edge of my bunk. I could feel the mattress compressed under their weight. I could feel the slight movement as they shifted position. I opened my eyes. There was nobody there that I could see, but the mattress was definitely compressed. I watched the indentation, the way the fabric curved down under invisible weight. I sat up slowly. The weight lifted. The mattress returned to normal. I got up and turned on my flashlight, swept it around the cabin, but there was nothing there. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next day, I hiked out to a spot where I could get cell service, and I called my supervisor. I told him I needed to move to the other station, that Mackenzie Creek had some structural issues that were making it hard to work. He told me the other station was still occupied and would be for another week. He asked if I could tough it out, and I said I would try. That night, I left the lantern on. I figured if something was going to happen, I wanted to see it. Around 10:30, I was reading one of the old paperbacks when I heard breathing. It was slow and steady, and coming from the direction of the other bunk. I looked over, but there was nobody there. The breathing continued, though. It was very calm and regular. And then it spoke. A man's voice, quiet, almost a whisper. "You should leave." I asked who was there, but didn't get any response. Just that steady breathing. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes. The breathing continued the whole time. And then it stopped on a dime, like somebody had, hit an off switch or something. The cabin went dead silent. I packed up my gear that night. I left a note in the logbook saying I was moving my base of operations due to equipment failure. I hiked out by headlamp and got to the trailhead around 4 in the morning. I finished my survey working out of the other station once it freed up. I filed my report. I did not mention anything about Mackenzie Creek except that the cabin needed maintenance. Last week, I was having drinks with another ranger, and I brought up the Mackenzie station. I asked if he knew anything about the history. He told me a ranger had died there in 1987, some guy named William Mackenzie, which is who the creek was named after. He'd been doing a solo assignment and didn't radio in for his scheduled check. When they hiked out to investigate, they found him in the cabin. Heart attack, probably, they said. He'd been dead for about 3 days. They found him sitting on one of the bunks. I asked if there was anything else, any other incidents. He said rangers had been reporting strange things at that cabin for decades. Doors opening, footsteps, voices. The Forest Service kept it in rotation because technically there was nothing wrong with it. But everyone who could avoid it did. I quit 2 weeks after that conversation. I told them I was moving back east to be closer to family. They seemed surprised, but they didn't push it. I don't really know what I experienced in that cabin. I don't know if it was the ghost of William Mackenzie or something else, or just my mind playing tricks on me after too many days alone in the woods. But it's kind of weird that so many of us would have our minds play tricks on us in the exact same way. All I know is I felt somebody sit on my bunk, and I heard that voice that told me to leave, and I'm never going back to the Bob Marshall wilderness. We Don't Talk About What Happened at Cloudland Canyon by Jennifer M. I'm writing this because my husband thinks that I'm losing it, and maybe putting it down will help me figure out what actually happened. Or, at the very least, maybe there's somebody else that has experienced something similar and can tell me I'm not crazy. Last October, we went camping at Cloudland Canyon State Park in the northwest corner of Georgia, right on the edge of Lookout Mountain. It was supposed to be a quick weekend trip. We'd been talking about getting away from Atlanta for months, and my coworker had recommended this place. She said the fall colors were incredible and the trails were challenging but manageable. We got there on a Friday afternoon, I think maybe somewhere around 1. The park has developed camping areas with bathrooms and water hookups, but we were looking for something a little bit more remote. There's a backcountry camping area about 3 miles or so from the main campground, accessible only by hiking trail. You need a permit, and they do limit it to a few sites, but we had reserved one, and we were site number 4. The hike in was absolutely gorgeous. The trail follows the canyon rim, and you get these views of the valley below, where you can see the layers of rock going down hundreds of feet. It was late afternoon when we started, and the light was hitting the trees at that perfect angle where everything looks golden. We got to the backcountry area around 6. There are 5 sites total, each one separated by enough distance that you can't really see the other campers, unless you're walking between sites. We passed Site 1 and 2 on the way in. Both of them were empty. Site 3 looked occupied, but I didn't see anybody around and figured they were out on a hike or something. Site 4 was perfect. There was a flat clearing, a fire ring, bare cables for hanging your food. We set up the tent and got a fire going before it got dark. We made dinner and had some whiskey, and we were just talking about nothing important. It was exactly what we needed. Around 10, we heard someone screaming. It was a really weird scream, though. It wasn't like a startled scream like somebody had been scared, but it wasn't like somebody was hurt either. It sounded like somebody was standing in the woods just beyond our firelight, doing a high-pitched shriek that went on for maybe 5 seconds, stopped, and then started again. It literally sounded like there was somebody in the woods just standing in place, screaming, waiting a beat, and then doing it again. Almost like they were practicing for a role or something. My husband Dave grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward where the sound was coming from, but there was nothing there other than the trees. The screaming stopped. We waited. There were about 2 minutes of complete silence. And then it happened again, but this time it was coming from a completely different direction, behind us, and it seemed like from deeper in the woods. Dave called out and asked if anybody needed help, but we didn't get a response. Just that shriek starting up again from yet another spot, this time to our left. I grew up in rural Tennessee, and I know what foxes sound like. I know bobcats and owls and coyotes and every other animal that makes weird noises at night. And this wasn't any of those. It was definitely coming from something with lungs. You could hear the breath behind it, and it was moving. Each time it started up again, it came from somewhere new, like whatever was making the sound was circling our campsite. We let the fire die down and went into the tent. Dave wanted to pack up and hike out, but I talked him out of it. 3 miles on an unfamiliar trail in complete darkness seemed a lot more dangerous than waiting until morning. We didn't sleep, though. We just laid there, listening, looking at each other. Around midnight, the screaming stopped, and we heard footsteps. Something was walking around our tent. They were not trying to be quiet about it either. They were just walking in circles, maybe 10 feet away. The rhythm of the steps was off. It was like when you try to walk normally after you sprained your ankle, but you can't quite get the pattern right. Like step, step, drag, step, step, drag, over and over. And then it stopped at the entrance of our tent. I am not exaggerating when I say that we could hear breathing on the other side of the fabric. It was this wet, heavy, moist breath like someone had just sprinted a mile. Dave had his hunting knife out. I had my hand on the bear spray. Neither of us moved. The breathing continued for, I don't know, maybe 3 minutes, and then whatever it was walked away. We heard the footsteps getting more distant, that same off-rhythm pattern, until finally we couldn't hear them anymore. We stayed in the tent until first light. We never said a word to each other. When the sun came up, we packed everything as fast as we could and started our hike out. We didn't even stop at the ranger station. We didn't report anything. We just got in the car and drove home. But here's the part that made me want to write this down. 2 days later, I got a call from an unknown number. Not an unknown number like it said unknown, but just I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick it up. It was a woman. She said her name was Angela, and she said she was calling because she had been camping at Cloudland Canyon over the weekend. She said she was in Site 3. I asked how she got my number. She said that she had asked the rangers who had been camping at Site 4, and they'd given her my contact information from the permit. I still kind of find that hard to believe, but I don't really have another explanation. One way or another, though, she got my number. Then she asked if we had heard anything strange on Friday night. I told her that we'd heard screaming and about the footsteps and everything. I was expecting her to say she had heard the same thing. Instead, she got really quiet. And then she asked me what time we'd heard the footsteps. I said, around midnight, I think. She told me that at midnight on Friday, She'd been walking back to her campsite from the bathroom area. She said that she had seen somebody standing at the edge of Site 4, just standing there in the darkness, facing our tent. She said she called out asking if everything was okay, and the figure had turned to look at her but didn't say anything. It just stared at her for a few seconds and then walked into the woods. I asked her what the person looked like. She said that's why she was calling. Because it hadn't looked like a person exactly. The proportions were wrong. The arms were super long. And when it walked away, the movement was really weird, like it was having trouble coordinating its legs. She said she'd gone back to her tent and packed up immediately. She hiked out with a headlamp at 1 a.m. because she didn't want to stay there. I asked if she had reported it to the rangers, and she said that she had. They told her it was probably just another camper, but she knew what she had seen and it was not a person. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. She wanted to know if I thought we should report it together, make more noise about it. I told her I didn't really know what we'd even report, that we saw something that didn't look quite human, that we heard screaming and footsteps. She seemed disappointed, but she understood. We agreed to stay in touch if either of us heard anything else about the area. I didn't hear from her again, until last week. She sent me an email with a link to a news article. A hiker had gone missing at Cloudland Canyon in December. A guy in his 30s who'd gone out for a day hike and never come back. They'd found his car at the trailhead, but no sign of him. The search had been called off after 2 weeks or so. The article mentioned that other hikers had reported hearing strange screaming sounds in the backcountry area during the same time period. Angela's email just said, "Same area. Thought you should know." I looked up Cloudland Canyon after that, started going through the forums and hiking sites. I found a few mentions of weird sounds. One person said they heard what they thought was a woman crying near the backcountry sites, but when they investigated, nobody was there. Another person said that they saw something walking on the trail at dusk that looked human from a distance, but when they got closer, it ran off into the woods in a way that seemed unnatural. But there was one comment in particular that stuck with me. Someone had posted asking if anyone knew the Native American history of the area. Someone else responded saying the Cherokee had stories about the canyon, about things that lived in the deep places that could mimic human voices and appearance. They said the word they used translated roughly to skinwalker, but it wasn't exactly the same as the Navajo concept. I don't know if I believe that, but then again, I don't know what I believe. What I know is that something was at our campsite that night. Something that could scream and walk and breathe. Something that stood outside our tent and then stood at the edge of our camp staring at another hiker. I know that Angela saw the same thing I heard. I know that both of us left our trips earlier than we meant to, because we felt unsafe in a way that went well beyond normal camping concerns. And I know that a man disappeared from that same area a couple of months later. Dave absolutely refuses to talk about it. He says we heard a fox or a coyote, that Angela probably saw another camper, and that we're connecting unrelated events because our brains want to make patterns. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am losing it. But I keep thinking about those footsteps, that weird pattern. It was like someone was trying to walk like a human but didn't really know how or something. I don't really know how to describe it, but I'm not going back there. I don't care how beautiful the fall colors are. If anyone reading this has experienced anything similar in the area or knows more about the history, I'd really like to hear about it. I need to know if what we encountered was an isolated incident or if this kind of thing has been happening for a long time. Because right now, I don't really know what's worse. The idea that there's something in those woods that shouldn't exist, or the idea that it's been there all along, and we just happened to notice it. Something Followed Us Back to Camp by Daniel H. I grew up in the Southwest and spent enough time around Navajo friends to know the stories. Skinwalkers are not a joke out there. People don't like talking about them, and when they do, it's usually short and careful. I am not Navajo myself, so I'm not claiming any authority here. I just know where you're not supposed to whistle, what you're not supposed to joke about, and which parts of the land people avoid without needing a reason. This happened in northern New Mexico. Winter, high elevation. Pinyon and juniper country, with patches of ponderosa. Snow on the ground, but not deep enough to stop hiking. Cold enough that sound carries. 2 friends and I were camping on public land, not far from the edge of Navajo Nation. We were careful about where we went. We didn't cross onto tribal land. We weren't sightseeing or ghost hunting, just a winter overnight to get out of town. We set camp before dark. Small fire, tents close together, and food hung properly. Nothing fancy. By the time the sun went down, the woods went dead quiet. It was just thick winter stillness, with no wind or animals at all. Around maybe 10 p.m., we started hearing footsteps. Not crunching snow, exactly. More like packed ground being stepped on carefully. Slow. Too heavy for a deer, and too controlled to be an elk. It circled the camp once, just outside of the firelight. We all heard it, but nobody said anything at first. We just looked at each other. Eventually, one of my friends whispered, "You hear that?" The footsteps stopped. That's when the smell hit. Wet fur with rotting meat underneath, like something that hadn't been cleaned properly. It drifted through the camp in waves. We added wood to the fire, and it stayed just bright enough to keep the trees lit at the edge. Whatever it was didn't come closer. It stayed just past where the light reached. And then it spoke. It sounded exactly like my friend Aaron's voice. The same tone and pacing. It said my name the way he always does, dragging out the first syllable slightly. It came from the trees to my left, not from where Aaron was sitting. Aaron went pale immediately. He shook his head without saying a word. The voice tried again, closer this time. Same casual delivery. It said something that only Aaron and I would normally joke about. Something dumb from years ago, and not something you would overhear. I felt this heavy pressure on my chest, like my body wanted to stand up and answer, even though my brain was screaming not to. None of us responded. The footsteps started again, moving faster now, circling tighter, still just outside of the firelight. The smell got worse, strong enough to make my eyes water. And then the voice changed. It dropped whatever attempt it was making to sound right. It started repeating my name, but the timing was wrong, like it was testing how the word fit in its mouth. I don't know how long this went on. Time felt stretched. The fire popped. Snow shifted in the trees. The thing kept moving. At some point, it laughed, but it didn't sound like a person. It sounded like air being forced through a shape that didn't quite know how to use it. It cut off suddenly, like someone turning off a radio. The footsteps stopped again, and everything went quiet. We stayed awake the entire night. The fire burned low, but we didn't dare let it go out. None of us slept, and none of us talked much either. Every once in a while we'd hear something from far off in the trees, but it never came into the light. At first light, we packed up, fast. We didn't bother with breakfast or coffee, we just wanted to leave. We saw the tracks, on the way out. They circled the camp in the snow, clear impressions, barefoot with long toes, heels too narrow. They didn't match any animal that I know of. The stride was wrong, too. The tracks led away from camp for a short distance, and then stopped, just ended in the middle of an open patch of snow. There were no return tracks or continuation. As we were hiking out, maybe a mile from camp, we heard Aaron's voice again behind us. He was walking right next to me. None of us turned around. It called out again, louder this time, like it was annoyed. The sound came from farther back than before, like it was keeping its distance for some reason. We didn't run, and we certainly didn't answer. We just kept walking until we hit the truck and drove straight home. I didn't tell this story for a long time. I don't even like writing it out. I know what people will say. Stress, cold, animals, group paranoia. All I know is this. I've camped in winter before. I've heard coyotes and owls and elk and people messing around in the woods. Nothing else has ever used my friend's voice to try to get me to step into the dark. My Uncle Stopped Hunting After What Followed Him Out of the Amazonas by Rodrigo M. My Uncle Tito stopped going into the jungle in 2019. He'd been a hunter his whole life. Grew up in Puerto Ayacucho in Amazonas state. He knew the rainforest better than anyone I've ever met. He could track anything, read signs in the mud and broken vegetation that I couldn't even see. The man was completely at home in places where most people would be lost in 10 minutes or less. When he quit hunting, he sold all his equipment. His rifles, his machetes, his camping gear, everything. He moved to Ciudad Bolivar to live with my aunt, and he won't talk about why. He won't even talk about the jungle anymore. If you bring it up at all, he changes the subject or leaves the room. I only know what happened because I was there for part of it. I was with him on what turned out to be his last trip into the Amazonas interior. This was October 2019. I was 23, working odd jobs, and Tito had invited me to come along on a hunting trip. He had a contract to provide game meat to a few restaurants in Puerto Ayacucho, and he needed help hauling it out. The plan was to go in for 5 days, hunt peccary and maybe some capybara, smoke the meat at a temporary camp, and bring it back out. We went in by boat first, up the Orinoco, and then up a smaller tributary. After about 4 hours, we beached the boat and started hiking inland. Tito knew where he was going. He'd hunted this area for years. The jungle there is dense, triple canopy, understory so thick you're cutting through it with a machete half the time. Hot, humid, loud with insects and birds. We set up base camp near a small stream on the second day. Tito had used this spot before. There was a clearing where someone had built a basic lean-to years ago, mostly rotted now, but the frame was still good. We strung tarps and hammocks, got our smoking rack set up. That afternoon, Tito went out to scout, and I stayed back to organize our supplies. He came back just before dark, looking thoughtful. He said he'd found peccary sign about 2 kilometers east, but something felt weird about the area. The forest was too quiet. He'd been walking for over an hour, and hadn't seen any monkeys, hadn't heard any howlers, barely saw any birds. In the Amazon, that's strange. The place is normally crawling with life. I asked him if he thought we should move camp. He said no, that we would see how it looked in the morning. We ate, talked for a while about nothing in particular, and went to sleep. The jungle at night is never truly quiet, but you get used to the background noise. The insects, the occasional bird call, something moving through the canopy. It all becomes white noise after a while. I woke up sometime around 3 a.m. because the noise had completely stopped. I lay in my hammock, listening to nothing. Not a single insect or frog or anything. I whispered to Tito, asking if he was awake. He whispered back that he was, that he had been for about 10 minutes. He noticed it too. We stayed really quiet, listening to the nothing. After maybe 5 minutes, we heard something walking near the edge of our camp. Bipedal, steady footsteps in the leaf litter. Tito had his flashlight. He turned it on and swept it across the clearing, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped. We waited. After another minute or so, they started up again, moving in kind of a half-moon shape around the camp. It was still just outside the range of our flashlight. This went on for maybe 20 minutes. The thing would walk, Tito would shine the light, and it would stop. We never saw what it was. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, and the jungle sounds gradually came back. The insects, and then some frogs, and then finally a howler monkey in the distance. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. When it got light, Tito went to look at the perimeter of the camp. He found tracks, and so I went with him to see them. They were in a patch of soft mud near where we had heard the footsteps. The tracks were humanoid, but not human. The foot was too long, maybe 16 inches. The toes were elongated and spread wide. The depth of the print suggested something very heavy. Tito stared at them for a long time. I asked him what he thought it was. He said he didn't know, but he'd heard stories from the Piaroa and Yanomami people who lived deeper in the jungle. Stories about something they called different names depending on the tribe. Tall things that walked like men but were not men. Things that followed hunters. He said we were packing up and leaving, and I didn't argue. We broke camp within an hour and started hiking back toward where we'd left the boat. Tito was moving faster than I'd ever seen him move in the jungle. He kept checking behind us. He wasn't saying much, but I could tell he was rattled. We'd been hiking maybe 2 hours when I heard something moving parallel to us through the forest. Something big, keeping pace with us, but staying back in the heavier vegetation. I couldn't see it, just heard the occasional crack of branches, the sound of something pushing through the understory. Tito heard it too. He stopped, and we listened. Whatever it was stopped when we did. We started walking again, and it started moving again, matching our speed exactly. Tito told me to keep walking and not look back. He said it in this tone that made it very clear that he was serious. We walked for another 3 hours straight without stopping. The thing followed us the entire time, sometimes close enough that I could hear it breathing. Deep, rough breaths that didn't sound quite right. When we finally reached the boat, it was late afternoon. We all but threw our gear in and pushed off immediately. Tito started the motor, and we headed downriver. I looked back at the shoreline as we pulled away. There was something standing in the trees at the edge of the water, tall, covered in dark hair. I only saw it for a few seconds, before the river bent, and we lost sight of it. Tito saw it too. I know he did, because his hands were shaking on the motor handle. We didn't talk about it during the ride back. We didn't talk about it when we got there. He paid me for my time and told me to go home. I tried asking him about it a week later. He told me to forget what we'd seen. That was the last conversation we ever had about it. 2 months later, he moved to Ciudad Bolivar. I've done some research since then. The indigenous people in the Amazonas have stories about forest giants, beings that protect certain areas and don't particularly like humans coming too close. The Piaroa call them Chirihida. The descriptions vary, but there are common elements. Tall, hair-covered, bipedal. They don't attack directly, but they follow people. They watch. They make their presence known. I don't know if that's what we encountered. Tito clearly believes it was something he didn't want to meet again. He gave up hunting, gave up the jungle, gave up a way of life he'd had for 40 years. That tells me everything I need to know about how seriously he took whatever was out there. I haven't been back to the Amazonas since. I don't plan to go back. Some parts of the jungle belong to things that were there long before us, and I'm content to let them keep it. The Echo in the Borean by Siobhan O. I grew up on a sheep farm in County Kerry, right on the edge of the Ivra Peninsula. It's a place where the mountains are made of old, bruised-looking stone, and the Atlantic wind is always trying to push you inland. My father used to say that the land there has a long memory, and that some of those memories don't like being disturbed. I used to think he was just trying to keep me from wandering into the bogs after dark, but I don't think that anymore. This happened last September. I had moved back home for a few months to help my mother after my father passed away. The farm is isolated, tucked into the valley that the locals call a coombe. The only way in or out is a narrow, winding borean, a dirt track with high stone walls and hawthorn edges that close in like a tunnel. It was a Tuesday, right around the time the light turns that strange watery gold before the mist rolls in from the sea. I was out in the top pasture, checking the fencing near a stand of ancient stunted oaks. The sheep were restless. They weren't grazing. They were huddled together in the center of the field, all of them facing the same direction, the deep woods that border our land. I heard a whistle. It was the specific, sharp, two-note whistle my father used to use to call the sheepdogs. It was unmistakable. He had a way of curling his lip that gave the sound a hollow, metallic ring at the end. I froze. My father had been buried in the churchyard at Caharsavine for 6 months. I stood there, the damp grass soaking into my boots, listening. The wind died down completely, and then I heard it again. "Siobhan, bring the shears." The voice came from just inside the tree line. It was his voice, the low, gravelly rasp of a man who had smoked a pipe for 50 years. It had the exact lilt of his West Kerry accent, but the cadence was off. The words were spaced out too perfectly, like a child learning to read. It didn't move. I knew better than to answer a voice in the woods, especially one that belonged to a dead man. I started backing away toward the gate, keeping my eyes on the dark gaps between the oaks. That's when I saw the glitch. A figure stepped out from behind a tree. It looked like my father. It was wearing his heavy waxed jacket, his flat cap, and his muddy green wellies. But as it walked toward the fence, its body didn't move in a straight line. Every 3 steps, the figure would snap back to where it had started. It would walk forward, 1, 2, 3, and then in a blink, it was back by the tree, repeating the same 3 steps. It looked like a video loop on a broken screen. The grass underneath its boots didn't bend. The brambles it walked through didn't snag on the waxed jacket. It was like a projection that was failing to sync with the physical world. The thing stopped at the fence line. It wasn't my father. The face was wrong. It looked like somebody had taken a photograph of him and stretched it over a frame that was too narrow. The eyes were just flat, matte black circles, and the mouth didn't have lips. Just a dark, horizontal line that opened and closed without moving the jaw. "Siobhan," it said again. This time, the voice didn't come from the mouth. The sound came from the air about 2 feet to the left of the figure. "Siobhan, bring the shears." I reached the gate and fumbled with the iron latch. The figure on the other side of the fence began to distort. It didn't melt or change shape gradually. It tiled. The image of my father broke apart into dozens of small square fragments, and for a second, I could see what was behind them. There was something tall and pale standing in the gap. It looked like a peeled willow branch, long and thin with too many joints in its limbs. It didn't have a face at all, just a smooth, white surface. It was holding a piece of my father's old twine in one of its long, spindly hands. The tiles snapped back together, and it was the image of my father again, only now the loop was getting faster. It was walking toward the fence, snapping back, walking, snapping, over and over in a blur of motion. The sound of his whistle began to repeat too, becoming a constant, high-pitched scream, like a teapot left too long, that made my ears bleed. I turned and ran down the boreen. I didn't look back. I could hear the thump, snap of the thing repeating its movements behind me. Somehow getting closer, even though it was stuck in a loop. It was as if the loop itself was moving through the world like a wave. I reached the farmhouse and slammed the door, bolting it shut and shoving the heavy oak dresser across the frame. My mother was in the kitchen, staring out the window at the mist. "Did you see him then?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of any surprise or alarm. "Mom, there's something in the top field. It looks like Dad, but it's not Dad. It's broken." My mother didn't turn around. She just kept staring at the white wall of fog pressing against the glass. "It's been trying to get the lilt right for weeks," she whispered. "It starts with the whistle, and then it tries the names. It's just the land trying to fill a hole that was left behind. It doesn't know how to be a person. It only knows how to repeat what it heard." Somehow, this did not comfort me. I stayed in the kitchen with her all night. We heard the whistle outside the window 3 times. We heard the sound of my father's boots on the gravel, repeating the same 3 steps, over and over until the sun came up. The next morning, I went out to the top field. I didn't go near the trees, but I looked at the fence from a distance. The top wire was snapped, but the ends of the wire weren't twisted or broken. They were perfectly flat, as if the atoms had just stopped existing in that space. On the ground, right where the figure had stood, I found a pile of wood. It was from one of our sheep, but it hadn't been sheared, it had been unmade. The fibers were straight, white, and organized into a perfect geometric cube, about 6 inches wide. It looked like a 3D printed object, made of biological material. We sold the sheep and moved to Killarney a month later. My mother doesn't talk about the farm, and I don't ask. I think about that white, jointed thing in the woods sometimes. I think about how it was practicing his voice. It wasn't a ghost, and I don't think it was a demon necessarily. It was a mimic that had found a flaw in the way our world was put together, and it was using my father's memory to wedge the gap open. I don't go back to Cary. I stay in the towns where the buildings are new and the ground is covered in concrete. I don't like places with long memories. I don't like the way the mist looks when it rolls off the mountains, because I know that if I listen closely enough to the wind in the hedges, I might hear my own voice coming back to me, waiting for its turn to be real. The farm is still sitting there, I suppose. The boreen is probably overgrown by now, but I wonder if the thing in the woods has finished the loop. I wonder if it finally managed to walk all the way to the house without snapping back. Rangers Don't Hike Devil's Staircase After Dark by Kevin H. I've been a park ranger at Zion for 3 years, and there's exactly one trail that I will not set foot on after sunset. Not for lost hikers, not for medical emergencies, not for anything. Devil's Staircase can wait until morning. The trail isn't officially called that. On the maps, it's listed as the Upper Emerald Pools Connector, but every ranger who's worked there more than a season calls it Devil's Staircase. There's a section about halfway up where the trail cuts through this narrow slot canyon, and the rock formations create these natural steps that go up maybe 200 feet at a steep angle, hence the name. It's a popular trail during the day. Moderate difficulty, good views, connects to some of the main attractions. We get probably 100 or so hikers on it every day during peak season. At night, it's different. I first heard about it during my training. My supervisor mentioned in passing that if we got a call about someone needing assistance on that trail after dark, we should stage at the trailhead and wait for backup before going in. He didn't explain why, he just said it was policy. I figured it was because of the terrain. The steps are uneven, and there's some exposure. Easy to fall if you're not careful. It made sense to wait for a full team. Then, I met Garrett. He'd been working at Zion for 12 or 13 years, and he told me the real reason. We were doing a routine patrol last spring, checking the backcountry sites, and we passed the Devil's Staircase trailhead around 7 in the evening. Still had good light. Garrett stopped and looked up the trail for a long time. Then he asked if anyone had told me about the girl. I said, "No, what girl?" He said there's a girl who hikes Devil's Staircase at night, alone. Rangers have been seeing her for at least 20 years. It's always the same description. 16 or 17 years old, long dark hair, wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. There's no pack or headlamp or any gear at all. She just walks up the trail at a normal pace. If you call out to her, she doesn't respond. If you try to follow her, she disappears. I asked if he was messing with me. He said no, that he'd seen her himself twice. Once in 2015 and once in 2019. Both times right around dusk. Both times, she was walking up the trail like she was just out for an evening stroll. The first time he had tried to catch up to her. He figured she was a lost hiker who needed help getting back before dark. He had jogged after her, and she had rounded a corner up ahead. When he got to the same corner maybe 10 seconds later, she was gone. The trail was empty in both directions. The second time, he had just watched her go. He didn't see any point in chasing something he couldn't catch. I asked if anybody knew who she was. He said that there were theories. A girl had died on that trail in 1987, fell from the steps during a storm. But she'd been 12, not 16, and the descriptions didn't match. Some rangers thought it might be older than that, maybe someone before the park was established. I didn't think much about it until last October. I was finishing a late shift, and I got a radio call about a possible distressed hiker on Devil's Staircase. A couple coming down had seen somebody heading up alone without any gear, and they were worried. I drove to the trailhead. It was almost 8, nearly full dark. I grabbed my flashlight and started up. I got to the steps, and I heard footsteps above me. Steady rhythm. Someone walking up. I called out, but no response. I climbed faster. The footsteps stayed the same distance ahead. I could hear them clearly. Boots on stone, never speeding up or slowing down. I got to the top of the steps and the sound stopped. I swept my flashlight across the area, but there was nobody there. The trail continues past the steps, but I could see a good 100 yards in both directions. If anyone had been there, I would have seen them. I radioed back that I had checked the trail and found no one and hiked back down. When I got back to my truck, Garrett was waiting. He asked me if I didn't remember the policy, and I said, no, I'd kind of forgotten about it. I figured I would just go check. He had heard my radio traffic, and he drove over. He asked if I had heard the footsteps, and I said yeah. He nodded like he expected it. He told me the footsteps are worse than seeing her, because when you hear them, you know she's close. Sometimes right next to you, even though you can't see anything. Wish I'd known that ahead of time. I don't hike Devil's Staircase after dark anymore. The policy makes perfect sense now. I found a child's toy hanging from a tree. I was doing survey work in a section of the forest that's pretty much untouched. I started to notice something bright hanging from a low branch. At first I thought it was trash, like something that had come out there in a storm with the wind, you know? But it was actually a small plastic toy. It was sun-faded, but pretty clean, like it hadn't been there for very long. Now, I can't stress enough that there are no houses, no campsites, absolutely nothing nearby that would explain this. I took a photo, left it alone, and figured that somehow somebody had lost it. I still couldn't explain why it got all the way out here and how it got up in a tree, but I tried not to think about it too much. When I came back the next day, the toy was gone. The branch it had been hanging from was still bent down, and I didn't see any signs of anybody passing through. I stopped working that area early and moved on. I still can't explain it, and it still gives me the creeps. The House on Nowhere Lane by Corey V. I've been delivering for a local pizza chain in the Fuquay-Varina, North Carolina area for about 3 years. It's mostly suburban runs, but once you get outside the main town limits, you hit these pockets of dense pine woods and old tobacco land that feels like it hasn't changed since the 50s. You get used to long gravel driveways and GPS signals that drop out the second you turn off the main road. Last Tuesday night, I took a delivery that should not have been on our map. The order came in late, around 10:45 p.m., just before we closed. It was for 2 large peps and a side of wings. The address was on, let's call it Old Cedar Road. I've lived in Wake County my whole life, and I'd never heard of it. But the system took it, so I bagged the food and headed out. The drive started normal. I headed south past the modern housing developments and the lighted gas stations, and then I turned onto a dirt track that my phone claimed was Old Cedar. The pines closed in immediately. It was one of those nights where the humidity makes the air feel heavy, and the fog was starting to roll out of the low-lying ditches. I drove for about 4 miles. My odometer was clicking up, but the scenery was strangely repetitive. I passed the same rusted-out tractor under a leaning shed at least twice. I figured I was just tired and circling a loop, but the road was a straight shot. Eventually, the trees opened up into a clearing. There was a house at the end of the gravel. It was a standard 2-story farmhouse, white siding, wraparound porch. It looked well-maintained. There were 6 lights on in the upstairs window, casting a warm amber glow onto the lawn. A blue sedan was parked in the grass. I pulled up, grabbed the heat bag, and walked to the porch. As I climbed the steps, the wood didn't creak. It felt solid, almost like I was walking on concrete, painted to look like wood. I knocked on the door. A man answered. He looked like any other guy in his late 30s, flannel shirt, jeans, bit of a beard. He smiled, handed me a $20 bill and a $5, and took the pizzas. "Have a good one," he said. His voice was clear, but it sounded like it was being played through a high-quality speaker, rather than coming from a human throat. I thanked him, pocketed the cash, and walked back to my car. As I was backing out, I glanced at the house one last time. The lights were off. And it wasn't like somebody just flipped a switch off, but the windows were suddenly boarded up. The blue sedan was gone. In its place was a thick patch of weeds that looked like they'd been growing there for decades. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, thinking the fog was playing tricks on my depth perception. When I looked again, the whole house was different. The white siding was gray and peeling. The wraparound porch had collapsed on one side. I didn't stick around to investigate. I put the car in drive and hauled it back down that dirt road. When I got back to the shop, my manager, Mike, was locking the back door. He looked at his watch and then looked at me. "Where have you been for 2 hours?" he asked. I looked at my own watch. It said 11:15. I told him I'd only been gone for 20 minutes. He pointed at the digital clock on the wall above the ovens. It said 12:45 a.m. I reached into my pocket to show him the money. I pulled out the $25 the man had given me. But it wasn't money. It was slips of paper, cut to the exact size of bills. They were blank and white, and felt like they were made of some kind of thin plastic or vellum. There was no ink on them at all. "The address was such and such Old Cedar," I said, trying to make sense of the lost time. Mike pulled up the delivery log on the computer. There was no record of the order. The last delivery on the screen was a drop-off at a townhouse complex 3 miles in the opposite direction. I checked my own phone's GPS history. It showed me sitting in the parking lot of the pizza shop for the last 2 hours. The next morning, I drove back out there. I wanted to see if I had just lost my mind. I found the turnoff for Old Cedar Road, but the dirt track ended after 50 yards at a locked gate, with a no trespassing sign that looked about 30 years old. Beyond the gate, there was nothing but overgrown forest. There was no clearing. There was no farmhouse. I walked along the fence line for a bit. About 20 feet into the brush, I found something white snagged on a briar. I picked it up. It was a cardboard pizza box, one of ours with the logo and the grease stains from the pepperoni. But when I opened it, the pizza inside wasn't moldy or rotten. It looked brand new and steaming hot, like it had just come out of the oven. I dropped the box and ran back to my car. I haven't told anyone else about the blank paper or the hot pizza in the woods. I kept the paper slips in my glove box for a few days, but when I checked them this morning, they were gone. There was just a little bit of gray dust in the corner of the compartment. I'm still working the job, but I will not take late-night rural runs anymore. I told Mike my car is having transmission issues and can't handle the gravel roads. He bought it, at least I think he did, but I also think he knows something is weird. He doesn't look at me in the eye when the sun goes down. He won't answer any questions about what might have happened. The weirdest part is the receipt. I found the original thermal paper printout in my trash can at home yesterday. It's dated for next Tuesday. The total is $25, and the customer name is just the resident. I have no idea what's going to happen next Tuesday, but I've already called out sick. I'm staying in my apartment with the lights on and the door deadbolted. I keep thinking about that man's voice and how much it sounded like a recording. I keep wondering if the resident is still out there in a house that doesn't exist, eating a pizza that never gets cold. I Found a Mirror Deep in the Woods by Eric T. I spend a lot of my time in the woods in Alabama, mostly on public land. I like to go out there to clear my head sometimes. No music or podcasts, just walking old logging roads and seeing where they go. I've done it for years, and I'm pretty comfortable being out there alone. This happened last fall, not far from the Talladega National Forest area. I won't say exactly where, but it was several miles past the last marked trail. The road turned into two ruts, and grass had started growing in the middle. I wasn't camping or hunting. I was just walking with a small pack and a sidearm, same as always. I noticed the mirror because it reflected sunlight straight into my eyes. At first, I thought it was a piece of metal, or maybe a road sign somebody dragged out there. There's a lot of illegal dumping, so that wouldn't have surprised me. But the reflection didn't move the way metal does when you change position. It stayed steady. I stepped off the road and found a full-length mirror nailed to a pine tree. Not leaned against it, nailed. 2 big nails right through the frame, sunk deep into the tree. The mirror looked old, but not weather-damaged. There were no cracks or no fogging. The glass was clean. That alone was strange enough that I should have left. But I didn't. I looked around first. No campsite or trash. No footprints that I could see. No ribbon or survey markers. Nothing that suggested anyone had been back there recently. The ground around the tree looked undisturbed. I stood in front of it and checked my reflection. It was me. Same clothes, same posture. Nothing obviously wrong at first. But the framing felt off. The mirror was perfectly vertical, flat against the tree. But the reflection looked like I was standing closer than I actually was. I took a step to the side. My reflection followed, but not right away. It lagged, just enough for me to notice. It was nothing dramatic or exaggerated, just late, like bad video buffering. I tested it again, stepped left. Delay. Stepped right. Same thing. I told myself it was uneven ground, or light doing something weird. That's what you do in moments like that. You try to keep things normal. But then I noticed the background. The woods behind my reflection didn't match the woods behind me. The trees were spaced differently. The ground sloped the wrong way. I turned around to check, and then looked back. The mirror still showed me facing forward. I hadn't turned at all in the reflection. That's when my stomach dropped. I raised my left hand slowly. In the mirror, my hand came up after mine stopped moving. I lowered it, same delay, and then my reflection blinked, but I hadn't. I took a step back, far enough that my whole body should have been visible, but the mirror only showed me from the chest up. The rest of me just wasn't there. I started hearing something behind me. Not footsteps, more like movement through leaves, slow and close. I didn't turn around. I kept watching the mirror. My reflection leaned closer to the glass. It didn't move. Its face looked exactly like mine, but the expression wasn't right. It wasn't scared or confused, and I sure as hell was. It looked focused, like it was studying me. I stepped back again. The reflection didn't follow this time. It stayed right up close to the glass, like it couldn't move any farther. And then it smiled. I don't smile like that. I don't bare my teeth when I'm nervous. The smile in the mirror was wider than mine, and held too long. That's when I finally turned around. There was nothing there, just trees, no movement or sound. When I turned back, the mirror didn't even show me anymore. It showed the woods instead, the other woods, the wrong slope, different trees, no person at all. I didn't touch the mirror. I didn't take a picture. I didn't try to test anything else. I walked away fast, but not running. I kept expecting to hear something behind me, but I didn't. When I got back to the road, I looked over my shoulder. I couldn't see the mirror anymore. No reflection or frames, just the trees. I went home and didn't tell anyone for a long time because I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane. I still walk in the woods. I still go out alone. But I don't leave the roads anymore. And I don't follow reflections. Something knocked on the cabin every night. I rented a small hunting cabin for a few nights during the off-season, completely alone. The first night, at about 2 a.m, there was one single knock on the front wall. It wasn't loud or aggressive, so I figured it was a branch or an animal or something, and I fell back asleep. The same knock happened the second night at almost the exact same time. By the third night, I was awake and waiting for it. When the knock came this time, it sounded closer, almost like it was right next to the door frame. I just sat there and held my breath. The last knock came, though, from inside the cabin, right behind me. I left before sunrise and did not finish my stay. I heard someone asking for help from the river. I was fishing along a remote stretch of river where I hadn't seen another human being all day. I was reeling in my line, and all of a sudden I heard someone yell help from downstream. It sounded kind of strained, like somebody trying not to panic, so I ran toward the sound, but when I got to where it should have been, the riverbank was empty. I didn't see any footprints or disturbed mud or anything in the water, So I was standing there, kind of confused, looking around and trying to figure out where the sound had come from. A few seconds later, I heard help again, but it was in the same voice, and it was the same distance, like it hadn't moved. I shouted back and asked where they were, but the voice never answered me directly, it just kept repeating the same word. The river was calm enough that I would have seen it if somebody was struggling. And then, for some reason, I just started to think about the bear scene in Annihilation. If you know, you know. And I was like, I don't think I want to be here anymore. So I backed away instead of following the sound farther downstream, and I just ran back to camp. I suppose it wasn't really camp, but where I had set up to fish, and I left. I left feeling really guilty, but I also wasn't super sure that whatever I had heard needed rescuing. I kind of had the feeling that if I had followed it, I would need rescuing. Anyway, hopefully it was just a fluke, or it was something I should have run from. I never heard about anybody dying out there or drowning or anything, so I still don't really know. I woke up to someone breathing outside my tent. By Maria. I was camping alone during a cold snap. I was zipped fully into my tent and all layered up. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I couldn't figure out why, but then I heard the sound of breathing, like right next to my head. It was really slow and steady, almost like somebody was trying not to be heard. And then I could see the faint fog, like puff against the side of the tent with every breath. I froze and just listened. I figured if I moved or acknowledged it, it would just make it worse. The breathing stayed that way for a really long time, and then it just slowly stopped. I never heard anybody walk away, but I just stayed awake until sunrise, just staring at the tent wall. When I finally unzipped it, there were 0 tracks. I don't camp in cold weather anymore. My name was carved into the tree. I was clearing brush on a piece of wooded land that my family owns, somewhere that I had worked plenty of times before. I noticed a fresh-looking carving on a tree near the back edge of the property. It was my full name, carved deep and clean like somebody had really taken their time with it. What really got to me, though, was the handwriting, because it looked exactly like mine, down to how I loop certain letters. I don't carve trees, and I definitely hadn't been back there recently. I checked older photos on my phone, but the carving wasn't there last year. The cuts were pale, they weren't weathered, so they had clearly been done recently. I felt really embarrassed at first, like maybe I'd done it and forgotten, but the longer I stared at it, the worse I felt. I finished my work closer to the house and left that area alone. That tree is still back there, and I make it a point not to look at it. Something walked around my tent all night long. By Mariah. I went camping during late fall when the leaves were really thick on the ground and it was just super pretty out. It's my favorite time. I fell asleep and not really that long after, I started to hear footsteps crunching around my tent on all the leaves. Now, footsteps out in the woods are not really that big of a deal, so at first I thought it was deer. But then I started to notice that the steps were very steady. It was definitely something walking on 2 feet, and it just sounded so human. They just kept circling. They would stop near my head, and then they would start moving again. I waited for breathing or snorting or something to indicate that it was an animal, but I never heard it. Every single time I would shift inside the tent, the footsteps would stop. And then, after I'd been still for a little bit, they would start again. This went on for hours. Finally, I saw light in the sky, and it just stopped. I walked outside to look for footprints or something, but the leaves were completely undisturbed, and I never saw anything to indicate what had been there. It just kind of felt like whatever was there didn't want to be or couldn't be seen in the daylight. I definitely got out of there in a hurry. I did finish my trip, but I was on edge the whole time. Fortunately, nothing happened for the remaining 2 days on my trip.